In today's AI world, there's no need to pay hundreds of dollars per month for a no-code marketplace tool or to pay thousands for a bootcamp to learn how to code. When I myself got frustrated with no-code tools because they're expensive and they're not that customizable, I finally decided to learn how to code, so I did a bunch of courses and classes on Udemy, Skillshare, Scrimba, and I also did a coding bootcamp. This cost me thousands of dollars, and the truth is there's absolutely no need to do that anymore because of AI. Using AI, you just need to know the basics of programming so that you know how to prompt the AI correctly. This will save you a lot of money and also make you way more flexible in terms of what direction you want to take your marketplace. I myself have recently built 4 online marketplaces. One is a marketplace for buying and selling Moomin mugs, which are very popular in the Nordic region. Another one is a marketplace for buying and selling stars. A third one is a marketplace for turning your house into a co-working space. And a fourth one was a marketplace for buying and selling host-read podcast ads. And this is what I believe you need to know in order to become a good AI marketplace developer. So first of all, you need to know the fundamentals. So here it's all about how the internet works, HTML, CSS, and basic JavaScript. Afterwards, it's all about picking a tech stack, and the one that we are going to be using in the course is React, Next.js, Tailwind, and MongoDB. Then we need to know what GitHub and Git is, and also how to push code to GitHub. We then move into the front-end part, which is based on React, Next.js, Tailwind, and DaisyUI. We then jump into how to deploy a site on Vercel, and also how to buy a domain name and how to set up the DNS records. We then jump into the backend part, which is all about creating API endpoints and setting up a database. Then we set up authentication using Clerk, and we also set up emails using Sendgrid. Then of course you always want to earn money on your marketplace, so we dig deep into Stripe and also Stripe Connect so that you can start earning a lot of money on your marketplace. Then we look at security and also some more advanced areas. And last but not least, we dig into AI, and I'll show you how you can build 100 times faster using AI. But remember that you cannot really build faster if you don't know the basics, because you wouldn't know what to prompt the AI basically. So that is why you need to know the basics first before jumping into using AI for building your online marketplace. So let's talking. Here's a free part of the course. It's quite important to understand how the internet works before we jump into anything else. So let me try and give you a quick example, right? So here, if you see, like, usually we call you the user who is browsing the client. So you are the client and you're sitting on your Wi-Fi internet. Let's say that, right? And you then go to google.com. So you type that into your browser. Let's say you're using Chrome. And then there's what we actually would call the internet. So there is what we call a DNS, which stands for domain name system. And that is basically just translate what you put in the browser into an IP address. And that IP address is then finding the server that is needed for actually giving what you're asking for. So in this example, it will then go to the Google server, which is located, I don't know, it could be in the whole world. They probably have multiple servers, so it depends on also where you are located, but most of them are probably in the US. So it will go to US, that server, and then give you back whatever you asked for, right? So in this instance, it will then give you back the HTML page for google.com, and then it will basically go back the whole route back to your browser, and your browser will then show you what you asked for. That is roughly how the internet works. And always remember that ChatGPT is basically your best friend, right? So you have to start using it all the time basically, right? So if you go to ChatGPT and then just put in, tell me how the internet works in an easy way, not technical. So then we will see what it actually says, right? And it usually compares it to something, right? So imagine the internet is like a postal system. Okay, cool. So then it basically tells you in an easy way how the internet works, comparing it to the postal system. So always go to ChatGPT and ask it if there's something you are not that sure about. It will help you massively. And as you can see here, it can really break it down for you in simple terms, right? So as it says here, you ask for something, your device sends the request, it travels the world, finds the right place, and then brings back what you asked for. So that's basically basically what I said just before. And if you go to any page and click on either the F12 on your keyboard, I think it depends a little bit if you're on a Mac or if you're on a Windows machine, but either click on F12 on your keyboard, or you can also go and search for console and then click on this one called developer JavaScript console. Then it opens up the console. That is important because here you can basically see the HTML for any page you look at, right? So you can see here that there's the HTML with the opening bracket, and then in the end there's always a closing bracket as well. You can also see there's something called a head here. This is where you usually add all the metadata that you use for SEO, for instance. And then there's also a body, which is where everything that you basically see is located inside, right? And then you can see there's also all these scripts. So these are JavaScript that are basically firing on the page when you do something, right? When you click a button or something like that, then there's usually some JavaScript doing the work in the background. But there are many other things you can also do in the console, so try and play around with it. If you, for instance, go to the network tab, this is where you will be seeing all the API requests that any page is making to their backends, right? So here, for instance, you can go, if you click up here, then you can basically put your connection to, for instance, a 3G connection, and then now if I refresh, it will then take a bit longer, as you can see here, to load the page compared to if I put it on no throttling. Now it should be much faster, as you could also see that it was, right? Like the console has many features which helps developers basically, so try and play around with it. It will really make your day and your life easier as an upcoming AI marketplace developer. Okay, and for coding we need a code editor. In theory you could actually do everything using just Notepad, but it would just take you much longer to write your code, and we're going to be doing it the easy way. So we are going to be using AI to code basically, right? And for that we need a code editor. And as I'm recording this video, there are mainly 3 options you can choose between. So there's Visual Studio Code, then there's Cursor, and then there's one called Windsurf. They all have AI capabilities. Visual Studio Code is the one that everybody used to use a couple of years ago, and it's owned by Microsoft, and it's kind of connected to GitHub Copilot, which is a pretty good AI solution. Then there's Cursor, which is the one we're going to be using because as I'm recording this video, that is the most popular one and it's the best supported AI one at the moment, I would say. And then there's one called Windsurf, which is also really good actually for AI coding. Again, we're going to be using this one called Cursor, so go ahead and download that one, and it does have both a Mac version and also a Windows version. So just choose the one that fits your computer. Great, and then let's try and make our first web page. So we're just going to make it using ChatGPT actually, right? So open up Cursor and then go to ChatGPT and ask it, let's ask it like, so make me an example of an HTML web page, right? So just a simple whatever page. So just so we have an example of our first web page actually, right? So here we go. So it's making us an example, as you can see here, right? So basically what you then do is that you go back to Cursor, go to File, then New Text File, and then we're just gonna copy paste this in there actually. So I copy here and then I just paste it in here. So Control C, Control V, right? And then we'll save it as a HTML page, right? So let's just call it example.html. So you have to put the .html after. That's similar to if you put in a .pdf, .something else. So that's like for a web page, it has to have the .html, right? And I'm just gonna save this one on my desktop actually. So I save it there and that's it, right? Okay, so I just moved it to my documents folder, but if I then open this one, so if I click here, you can see, okay, welcome to my first web page. Hello, this is a simple HTML page to show how websites work. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Want to learn more? Visit V3 schools. So that's cool, right? So ChatGPT even added a link here, right? So that is pretty cool. So basically what you just did, you basically just made your first web page. How cool is that? And let's just go back to Cursor to actually look at it, right? So as you can see here, there's a head, as you can see here, where we have some styles, and then we have the body with a closing tag as well. This one, A, is a link. So it's basically adding a link here with an href link here, right, to this website, which is the v3schools.com, which is, by the way, a cool page you should bookmark because it has a lot of relevant information for upcoming developers. So basically that's really cool, right? And you can also see here it adds some style, right? So here in the head it is adding some style. So for instance on the body here it's saying, okay, the font family should be Arial or sans serif, and the margin should be 40 pixels, background color should be this one, and then it adds different colors for the H1, which is this one, and then for the P tag it adds a different color, right? So that is really cool. So you just made your first web page. Congratulations. And by the way, you might be wondering what all of these ones inside a tag is called, right? So this is called an attribute, and lang is basically the attribute name, and then the en is the attribute value, right? So basically this attribute is basically telling the browser that the language of this web page is English, right? And another attribute, you see that one down here, so this one called href, and then this URL here. So that is basically just telling that when you click on this one, it should take you to this page basically, right? So this is a link tag, right? Which is also called an A tag. And let's now try and share our newly made web page with someone. I'm just gonna share it with myself though, but just so you see how it works, right? So if I just go to my email, or it could be on WhatsApp, on Slack, on Discord, or whatever way you want to share your newly made web page, but try and do it because it's interesting to see how it works. So I'm just gonna send myself an email here. So I just put this one in here, and then yeah, I'm just sending an email to myself, but I'm just gonna say check this one out, and I'll then send it, right? So where do I actually send it? I have to then close this one and click send here, right? So I'm gonna send this one, and then when I open the email, I can click here, and then it's gonna open the page for me, right? So I have to download it first, and then when I click here, it's gonna open the page. So basically, as you can see now, you already made your first web page that you can share with someone, and then when they open it, it will look like this. So that's pretty cool, huh? Great, so now that we know the basics about HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript, it's basically time to pick a tech stack. And the reason why we are doing that is basically because it will be much faster to code this way. You could actually do everything in pure JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, but it would just take you a long time. So that's why all developers are basically using other kinds of frameworks to build their marketplaces or their apps. And you can basically pick any tech stack you would like to. So I'm using the one that I will go through right now, but you can basically choose any tech stack that you would like to. It doesn't really matter actually, as long as you stick to it and become better and better at it, because that is the most important thing, to basically become faster at coding all the time. And for that, you have to stick to what you picked from the beginning. So let's go through it. So what we're going to be doing in this course is that we are going to be coding in JavaScript, but on the front end, instead of coding in pure JavaScript, we're going to be using React, which is a JavaScript library. Then we're going to be using Next.js, which is a React framework. And then we're going to be using for the CSS, we're going to be using something called TailwindCSS, which is basically a way to write CSS easier. And on top of that, we're also going to be using DaisyUI, which makes it much easier to make beautiful buttons and components and so on. You will see. For the backend, we will also be using Next.js because it's just the easiest. Once you started using Next.js on the front end, you might as well also just use Next.js on the backend. You could also have a separate backend like in Node.js, for instance. But to be honest, when we are using Next.js on the front end, it makes sense just to use Next.js on the backend as well. So meaning that we will have all the routes and so on in the same repository. For the database, we will use MongoDB. So everything will be stored on our MongoDB database. And then for third-party tools, we'll be using a couple. So for authentication, so for login and sign up, we'll be using Clerk. Then we will be using Stripe and Stripe Connect for payments. So Stripe Connect is the easiest to use when making a marketplace. And for email sending, we'll be using Sendgrid. And then we will be using Google Analytics for analytics. So this is what we'll be going through, and I just want to mention that I'm not sponsored by any of these tools here, so just so you know. And again, you can pick any tech stack you would like. This is just the one that I like working with, and this is the one that I will be using in the rest of the course. I also want to mention that all of these ones have free versions basically, right? So you don't actually have to pay for any of these tools, which is awesome. Good, and before we move on, we just need to know a couple of things about some different stuff here, right? And one of them is the terminal. So what is the terminal? How does it work? So the terminal is basically a way to communicate with your computer in a text-based way, right? So you prompt it basically what to do. So to open the terminal, it's a little bit different depending on if you're on a Mac or on a Windows. On a Windows PC, I believe you have to go to the Start start and then search for terminal and then open it that way. On a Mac, you can use the find by clicking the command space and then type in terminal and click enter, and then it opens up the terminal. Here it is. And then you can basically use a different set of prompts to do stuff, right? So for instance, you can write pwd and then it tells you what folder you're in, and you can also write, for instance, cd desktop, and then it goes to the desktop, for instance. So there are different things you can do here. But if you then open up Cursor, and if I go to one of my projects, you can see down here that I also have a terminal. So if I just close this one, and if I then go up here to the terminal and then click new terminal, then you can see there's a terminal here. So basically you have to know what the terminal is, because we are going to be using it all the time here. So here, for instance, I can start the development server by typing npm run dev, and then it's gonna start the development server as you see here. Okay, so let's move on to setting up your computer. We already previously set up your code editor where we're using Cursor, so we're gonna skip that one for now because you should already have Cursor installed. If not, then please go ahead and install it. And we're gonna move on to Node.js. So what is Node.js? So on a browser like Safari or Google Chrome, there's something called a V8 engine, and that one allows you to run JavaScript in the browser. So for instance, if I go here to UMI star and I click F12, I have this console area where I can basically write JavaScript. So if I make a variable like a const that we just learned before, so const Rasmus equals to, let's say, 15. So now I can then write Rasmus and it will return 15. So as you can see, we can run JavaScript in the browser. So the V8 is basically what makes it possible to run JavaScript in the browser. When we start coding, we need something similar, and that's why we need Node.js. So Node.js basically makes it possible to run JavaScript anywhere on our computers. And by the way, to install Node.js, just go to Google and type in Node.js install, click on the top one and scroll down and download this package here and install it. And remember that there are no sponsors for this video. The only sponsor is myself, who created this course to make anyone an AI marketplace developer. There are already more than 50 students, and in the course we're basically digging deeper into all the topics that you're hearing about in this video so that you can become an AI marketplace developer fast. When you get access to the course, you will have additional material for all the parts, and there's also a Discord channel where us AI marketplace developers are helping each other and discussing how to build awesome marketplaces. Okay, and next up we have to install Next.js, and again we're going to be using Next.js both for the front end and also for the back end. On the back end, we could also use something like Node.js, for instance, to have a separate backend somewhere, but honestly, when using Next.js, it's much easier just to have both of them, so both the front end and the back end in the same repository. So that's why we are also going to be using Next.js on the back end. And the way it works with Next.js is that, again, Next.js is a framework for React, and React is a JavaScript library. So what we learned just before about, we were making the page.htmls, and we could then see them by opening them in the browser, or we could also send them to someone and then they could open them. It basically works a little bit different in Next.js. So basically we're going to be building in JavaScript, so .js. We could also be building in TypeScript, but that's a little bit more advanced. So I believe it's easier to start with JavaScript, and then later on you can always move to TypeScript if you feel like it. But we're basically going to be building in JavaScript, and then there's a process that basically turns our JavaScript files into HTML pages, and that process is run by Node.js that we were just talking about just before. Good, and now to install Next.js, I think it's actually easiest if we combine these two down here to install Next.js. So first, actually, we will install GitHub, so create an account for you and then connect your account to your GitHub desktop, it's called. So we will actually start by that, and then afterwards we will open a new project, a new repository, where we will then install Next.js. So first of all, what is GitHub? GitHub is basically like a Google Drive, you could call, for your code. So basically you have all your code there. So if you lose your Mac or your computer for some reason, you actually can still access it because you have it on GitHub. So it's a Google Drive kind of. So first of all, go to GitHub and then click on the sign up button here, and then add your details and then create an account. Good. And then after you've done that, go to Google and then type in install GitHub desktop, and then scroll down and click here and then install GitHub desktop. The first time you open GitHub desktop, you will have to to connect it to your GitHub profile. So there might be a button over here that asks you to connect to your profile, but if there's not, then just go to up here and go to settings and then just connect here. You can see that I'm already connected to my profile, but you'll basically just connect it to your profile like this. And if you still find it difficult, search for how to authenticate to GitHub in GitHub Desktop, and then there's a whole guide here on GitHub that takes you through exactly how to do it. Good. And once you've then done that, you should have something like this open. So this is basically GitHub Desktop. So GitHub Desktop is another way of basically managing your communication with GitHub, you could say. So instead of pushing and pulling via the terminal, we are gonna do it on GitHub Desktop, this one. So basically here you can see all my repositories and so on, right? So what we then do is that we click here and then we click on add and we click on create new repository. So do that. And then just for now, I'm just gonna be putting in something here. So I just put in example, for instance. I don't need to add a description. I'm just gonna be placing it in my GitHub folder. You can choose any folder you would like. Just leave this as it is for now and then click on create repository. Cool. So now we have a repository made and we can then publish it, and let's actually just go ahead and do that. So if I publish it, it's gonna push it to my GitHub. So let me just do that. And I have this one as private. So I'm just gonna be publishing it, and now it's basically pushing that new repository to my GitHub. So kind of the Google Drive. So if I click here on view GitHub, it then takes me to that new repository where there is nothing in it right now. That's basically how it works. So now this repository is also on GitHub. If I go back to GitHub Desktop, let's click on up here and then click on new branch and make a development branch as well. So I put in here development and click create branch, because it's always good to have two branches, a development and a main, and maybe even a third sometimes, but at least you should have two branches. So here you can see I can then click on development, and let's also just push this one as well. So I'm gonna be publishing that branch as well. So if I then right click up here, you can see that I can now do a couple of things here. And if I click open in cursor, it's basically gonna open that in cursor. Cool. So here we are in the repository now. So let's click on terminal and click on new terminal. Awesome. So you can see there's nothing in it now. We just have a completely empty repository. Okay, good. And by the way, if I go back here to GitHub Desktop, I can also click here to show in Finder, and then it's basically gonna open it up in the folder in my Finder, and there's nothing in it, as you can see here. Awesome. So let's go back to the repository, and now let's install Next.js. So if I go back to Google, and if I just type something like this into Google, install Next.js, I can see that they have like this getting started. So if I click on that one and then just scroll down to here, you can see like they have something called automatic installation, which is a package where it basically installs different things for us, right? So if I just copy paste this one, npx create next app at latest, I copy that and then go back and paste it in here and just click enter. It is then gonna ask me a couple of questions here, right? Okay, cool. So it says create next app, so I'm just gonna say yes. Cool. So then it goes on, what is your project named? I'm just gonna put in example. Would you like to use TypeScript? Actually, usually I use TypeScript, but for this we are gonna go ahead and use just JavaScript. So go on no. Would you like to use ESLint? Yes. I'm gonna explain that later. Would you like to use Tailwind? Yes. And would you like to use code inside source directory? And we're also gonna click yes to that. Would you like to use the app router? Yes. And would you like to use the turbo pack for Next.dev, which is something that makes Next.js a little bit faster? Let's just say yes to that. And for this one, would you like to customize the import aliases? So for now, we're just gonna say no to that. And now it basically goes ahead and installs all these dependencies for us. Awesome. So now you can see that we have installed it, and up here we have all these files now that we're gonna go through in just a minute. So we have this public folder, we have a source folder, and we have a gitignore, and we have a lot of other things here. So that is basically how you install Next.js. And now you're probably thinking, what are all these files for? And it was so much easier before, just when we were doing JavaScript and HTML and CSS. Well, I can tell you that over time this will get much easier, but let me take you through the most important ones, right? So there's often a README file, which is just an explanation of how to basically run this project that you made maybe, or just some explanation about what it is. Then there's a post.css.config, which is used for the CSS setup. Then there's a package package.json, which basically tells you all the packages and all the scripts that you have, and we will get back to this in more detail later. There is also a package log.json. Then there's a next config, which is just some config for Next.js. There's also a JSON config, and then there's an ESLint config and a gitignore file. So the gitignore file, that is where you basically tell what files should not be pushed to your GitHub. So you can see here that we added the node modules, .pnp, coverage, Next.js /out, and so on. This is something that Next.js actually added themselves, but you can also add other files in here. For instance, it's very important to have the .env file here, so we don't want to push the .env file. Then there's a source, and inside the src there is the app folder, and in the app folder, that's where we have all our pages, and we will also have the API folder in there where we will have all our routes, but we will get back to that later. And then there's also a public folder where we have everything that we want to have public. So usually we add all our images here and so on. You can also see here that there's a node modules folder that is in a little bit of a gray color. That is because it's added here in the gitignore, so this folder is not being pushed when we push to GitHub. Awesome. And now let's also just quickly talk about GitHub and how these different commands works, right? So basically, as you can see here in GitHub desktop, now we have all these files here that are kind of waiting to be committed, you can see here, right? So basically how it works is that if there's something on GitHub that I want to pull down to my local project, I will then pull it from GitHub to my local computer. So that is used all the time when you work in teams, of course. So if you work in teams of maybe 2, 3, 10 developers, everyone is pushing their changes to GitHub, and you can then pull the changes down to your local computer. So that is the pull. So when you use add, that is basically when you add something to a commit that is then kind of in a staging stage, you can say, right? So when you add something, you basically add it to staging. So basically I can do that here. So if I wanted to add this to staging, I'll basically just add something here. So I would add a text saying like initial setup, and then I basically just commit that, as you can see here. So now it is in a staging area here, right? So I can click here on history, and I can see that this initial setup has all these changes. It's just the initial installation of Next.js. Cool, but I haven't pushed it yet. So if I then want to push this, I will then push it here by clicking this button, and then it will be pushed to my GitHub repository. So if I click here and I push, then you can see it's being pushed. And then if I click here, I click on preview and create pull request. That is being done because, as I was saying before, I have two branches. So I have the development and I have the main. So now we push to development, but then we're basically making a pull request from the development branch to the main branch. And you do that by just clicking here on merge pull request, and then you confirm the merge. So now it is being merged from development into the main branch. Cool. And then if you click here and you click on view on GitHub, it will then take you to GitHub. And now you can see that we have the initial setup here, and everything is here on the main and also on the development. So that is basically how it works. So before we move on, there are just a couple more things we have to be aware of. One of them is the package manager. There's something called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager, and it's basically like a directory of modules of cool packages that you can use for anything, right? So whenever you start building, a lot of times you actually don't have to build what you think you might have to build, because there might be a package you can just install instead for free that you can use instead. So for instance, there's something like this. This is like a React date picker. So imagine you wanted to build this kind of date picker. There might be something here on NPM that you can just search for and then install instead. So it is really cool, and it's amazing how much there is, and it's pretty much all for free. So you should really check that out. And if I then jump into our code, whenever you install a package, like a dependency it's called, it will be placed down here in the package.json, right? So here you can see dependencies and dev dependencies. So right now we don't have that much installed. We have React, React DOM, and Next. That's it. But eventually we will have many more packages installed down here, which is very normal. normal. And some of these packages might rely on other packages, and that's also quite normal. Now let's go ahead and install a package, because this is something you will for sure be doing eventually. So again, I'm here in the package.json, and these are the packages I have installed so far. So let's do it. So first of all, I'm just going to open a new terminal. So I go here to the terminal and click new terminal, and then I just make sure that we are in the right folder. I write pwd, and then it tells me what folder I'm in. And actually I place the example folder within the example. So I'm just going to write cd example, and then I am in the right folder, pwd example. Yeah, so I'm in the right folder now. And first of all, we should actually just install everything that we have so far. And in order to do that, you basically write npm install. So then it installs all the packages that you have here. So let's do that, npm install, and then it is installing all the packages, and that will take a couple of seconds. Now let's go back to the npm area and find a package that we want to install. And actually I already found one, so let's just try and install this react-datepicker. And the way you install is by writing npm install and then package name. So package name like this, right? And you can actually also just write npm I and then package name like this. And actually when you use the npm page here, it always tells you how to install the packages. So for instance, if we wanted to install this one that we're going to be doing right now, then you can see here I can actually just copy, well, I can just click here and then it will copy it to clipboard. So the way you install this package is basically by writing npm I react-datepicker. So I'm just clicking here and then it copies it to clipboard. I then go back to my code and I delete this that I just wrote here, and then I just paste that one in here and click enter. And then it basically installs this package. Okay, good. And then we should see it up here immediately after. And you can see that it's now here, react-datepicker. So we just installed a package. Great, so now we know how to install packages. Now we also need to know how to run something. So if I go back into the code and I'm in the package.json, you can see up here that we also have these scripts. So the one we're going to be using a lot is the npm run dev. And basically the way you run these scripts is by typing in npm run and then the name, right? So npm run and then the script name. So in this instance, we're going to be running the dev. And when I do this, it basically opens up a local server that I can then use for coding. So if I then press enter now, it's going to start the local server here, and you can see it's on the local host 3000. So you can basically either just copy it, or you can also just click the command key and then click it, and then it's going to open the local server. And as you can see here, it already has a web page of a Next.js template. So congratulations, you just made your first local instance of a web page. Great, so just a quick recap of NPM. So NPM stands for Node Package Manager, and that is basically a directory of awesome packages that other coders made and put online for free. So whenever you need to code some kind of feature, always go there and check if there's actually something that you can just get from there instead of coding everything by yourself. That's very normal. Every developer is doing that. So there are a couple of commands that you should know about. First of all, to install, you write npm install and then the name of the package. To run a script, you type in npm run and then the script name, and that if you do a npm run dev, then it opens up the local server on your computer. And you can also run a npm update and then the name of the package name, because it is very normal that a package comes with updates maybe every 6 months or so. Now another tool that a lot of developers are using is called a linter, and the one that we're using is called ESLint. So let me show you how it works. So if I go to our project and then just go into any page that we would like to have a look at, and if I for some reason had, for instance, forgotten to add this closing tag here, you can see I remove it, but then there's this red curly underline here, right? So if I hover above it, you can see that it tells me here JSX element A has no corresponding closing tag. So it's basically telling me that I'm missing something here. I can even click here in the fix in chat, and then it will basically fix it for me here using AI, right? So all I have to do here is basically just click actually here here on accept file, and you can see that it added the closing tag for me. So ESLint is basically just a tool that makes developing much easier. Now let's talk about Git and version control. So basically Git is a way to manage your code so that if you make a new version and commit that one, then you have it somewhere stored. So if you figure out later on that you made a mistake and want to go back to what you had before, then you can basically do that using Git. And there are these different commands like git add, git commit, git push that I actually showed before. I was just using GitHub Desktop, if you remember correctly, right? So in GitHub Desktop, you basically can do these 3 commands. I would recommend you using GitHub Desktop for doing this basically. But you could also do the same here within the code. So these commands, instead of committing via the GitHub Desktop, you can basically just write this command in the terminal down here, or you can also do it up here. Actually, if you go to this icon here, then you can also commit here. So there are different ways of doing the same thing basically. But again, I would recommend you using GitHub Desktop because it is just a little bit easier to understand it when you're starting out. Okay, and again, the gitignore file that we have in all our projects is the one that where we add all the things that we do not want to push. So for instance, you can see that we have this node modules folder here. The node modules folder that we see here, that one is huge. And as I was saying, there are lots of packages in there that we are not necessarily using. So we don't want to push that one every time we push, right? So that is why we here in the gitignore added here as a /node modules. So everything you don't want to push here, you add to the .gitignore file basically. Now for installing Git on your computer, go to Google and type in install Git and then click on the top one, which will take you here. And if you're a Windows user, just go here and then download this one and install it, and that's done. It's a little bit more complicated if you are a Mac user like I am. So then you click here, and then you can see you first have to install something called Homebrew. So click on that one, and then you can see that there is this way of installing it. So if you click here to copy it and then open the terminal, and then you basically just paste that one in here and click enter, and then it starts to install it. But you have to first add your password. And you can see that it asks me to click enter, so I click enter, and then it starts to download and install Homebrew. So that will take a little bit of time. Now afterwards, go back again and then put this one in the terminal. And as you can see, I already have it installed, but this is the way to install it. And remember just to read what it says in the terminal. If it wants you to do something else, read it and then do that. This is how you install Git. And remember that installing Git is only something you have to do one time on your computer, right? So if you have already done it and you're on your second project, then you don't have to do this again. So it's only something you have to do the first time, or if you just bought a new computer, a new Mac, then you have to redo it, but that's it. Great, so now that we have Git installed, then we should basically commit every time we make some changes in our project. So let me show you how that works and why it is a smart thing. So again, we are here in our example project, and it looks like this at the moment. So it's just the Next.js template page, you could say. So let's make some changes. So let's go ahead and remove the image, for instance. So the image is gone. Let's change maybe this to Rasmus Awesome Web Page. So here it says Rasmus Awesome Web Page now. And then let's also remove this one, right? So it just says Rasmus Awesome Web Page. Cool. So now we made some changes, and we then want to basically push those changes to GitHub. Okay, so how do we do that? Again, we open up GitHub Desktop, and here you can then see the changes that you made, which is awesome, right? So it gives you a really visual way of seeing what changes you made, right? And you can also see what file you made the changes within. So now you want to write a comment on what changes you made so that you can easily remember it later, right? So I'm just gonna write made some small changes to the front page. And then I click on commit one file to development. And again, we are on the development branch. You should always be coding in the development branch and then make all the changes there. And then in the end, if all is good, then you basically merge the development branch with the main one. So I'm just gonna commit and then push origin. So I'm basically pushing my changes to development branch on GitHub. And then you can see it asks me if I want to make a pull request. So I create a pull request that will then merge the development into the main. So I click here, create pull request, and then in a second I can then merge pull request. And again I click confirm merge. Basically what it did there is that it merged the development into the main one. And that is really cool. So if I go back here to GitHub desktop, I can then go here and click on view on GitHub, and then it opens up the branch on GitHub. And GitHub again is like a Google Drive for your code. So if I then go here and go down to the development branch, I can see that there are 4 closed. And if I click there, you can see my last changes here where it says made some small changes to the front page. If I go back to the code here and click on the main branch and then click on pull requests and click here 4 closed, you can see the same one. So the same one here, it says made some small changes to the front page. So basically, again, the reason why it's really good to make these commits all the time basically is because if you then make a mistake at some point, which is quite normal as a developer, then you can always roll back to your last commit basically. So that is how it works. And one more thing I just want to say before we move on is that you might be a little bit confused about all these files now, and it might seem a little bit overwhelming, and where is the initial HTML page that I told you about in the very beginning, and so on, right? Again, I just want to say the reason why we're using React and Next.js, and again, React is a JavaScript library and Next.js is a React framework, is basically to build faster. Most developers these days are using frameworks, and it's just because building in pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript would take way too long time, so that's just not a smart way to build anymore. So that's why we're using Next.js as a React framework, basically to build faster. So if I go back again, I also just want to tell you that if there's something you're unsure about, then you should just start using AI basically. So if you click up here to the right where it says toggle AI panel, you can pull up the AI chatbot, and then you can just start asking it stuff, right? So for instance, if you wanted to know about what is the public folder, then you can just mark that folder. So you add an at and then public and do like that. And then you just ask it, what is this folder used for? And then it's basically gonna answer you, which is really, really cool, right? So it's basically saying here, let's see what it says. The public folder in a Next.js project serves a specific and important purpose. Static file storage is used to store static assets that need to be served directly to the browser, such as images, icons, and so on, right? So again, you can see I can just ask the AI about stuff, right? And you have to get used to just asking all the time because it is your best friend now. So that's what I just wanted to say. Now let's move on to actually building cool stuff. So now we know the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we've also set up our computers so we are ready for building basically. So let's start building. And to begin with, we are going to be building a static page, just a front end. And for that, we are going to be using React, Next.js, and Tailwind for styling. And I want you to code along with me because later we are then going to be deploying the page on Vercel so that everyone has access to it, so that you can basically send it to any friend or family member that you would like to send your page to, and they will be able to access it on the internet. So let's do it. Great. So now let's start by opening up the project. So I go here and click on GitHub desktop, and then I choose the example repository that I made. But if you haven't made one yet, then please go ahead and make one because it will make it much easier for you to basically learn. So you should make a repository, and the way you do it again is to go here and click on add and then create new repository. Good. And then you just click here on open in cursor. And if you don't see this open in cursor, then it's because you haven't installed cursor yet. So then you have to install cursor first. So please go ahead and do that, and then click click on open in cursor. So we open it up and you can see we have the terminal down here. Now just to be sure that we are in the right folder, I'm gonna write pwd here and then it tells me what folder I'm in. And just because I actually made the example within an example folder, then I have to write cd example. So just make sure that you are in the right folder for your project, because if you're not, then it is not gonna be working when you write then npm run dev that we're going to be writing now. So we're gonna be writing npm run dev now in order to run the local server, npm run dev, and then you can see it starts up the local server. Cool. And if it's not working for you, then it's because you're not in the right folder. Cool. And then I'm gonna open this one and then we're gonna see what it looks like. Awesome. So it just looks like this. So let's clean it up a little bit more actually. So here on the page.js, let's just remove all this down here actually. Let's remove this like this, and actually we're also just gonna be removing the footer for now. So we remove the footer so it just looks like this for now. And now let's go through the most important parts of React. And again, React is a JavaScript library and it basically makes it easier to build stuff for the front end. And we're not going to cover everything that you can do with React. We are going to be covering the most important parts that you need to know in order to build a marketplace using AI, because there are some concepts that you still need to know even though you know how to use AI, because if you don't know the basic concepts, it will still be very hard to build a marketplace using AI. So let's do it. The first one is components. So what are components? So a component in React is a reusable part. So let's say you have your page, which is the front page here on You Are My Star. And you can see I made these red boxes here. So the header, this hero section, and then this button, and then this one down here, which I call the featured section, featured stars section, I think it's called. So the cool thing about React is that you then make these kind of building blocks that you can use different areas on your pages. So this button, for instance, I can also use that on other pages if I wanted to, or inside other components. And the same with the header that I'm using on pretty much all pages. And for the hero, I could also use that one easily on other pages if I wanted to. And same with the featured stars section down here. So over it now, you can see that it is much smarter to build this way, because you only have to build once and then you can use it multiple places. And usually you have all your components inside the app folder, where you make a folder called components and then you place your components in there. So let's make one. So if I make one here, I click here on making a new file, and then I make one called button with counter.js. So JS for JavaScript, and then I click enter. It's important that you name your components so that you easily yourself can remember what that component is doing, but also so that the AI knows what it is. So now I made the first very simple component, and it's still called button with counter. There's no counter yet though, but there will be soon. So you can see that it's basically returning a button that says click me, and then we're exporting it down here as button with counter. So you have to export your components so that you can use them in other pages, for instance, or in other components. So that's why I'm exporting it here. And all of this up here, like this class name and so on, this is CSS stuff that we will get back to in the Tailwind section soon. But let me just try and import this one then in the page.js. So if I go here to page.js, and then here in the top, I import it like this. So I import button with counter from components and then slash button with counter. And then I basically just use it down here after the return. So here I will then just do like this, and then you can see that it is displaying here. So you always have to import it first and then use it here in the return section. And let's see what it looks like. So if I go back to here, you can see that I now have a button here that says click me, but nothing happens if I click on the click me though. And notice that now the component is reusable. So if I copy it and just do like this, so I paste it a couple times, if I do like this, then let's see what it looks like on the page. If I go to the page, you can see that now there are 5 click me buttons. So that's why it's so awesome to use components, because they're reusable. You can use them on any page now that you would like to. Now let's also just talk about props. So props is a property you can pass in your components to make them customizable. So you basically add them up here like this in the function props, and then you basically have an object as a parameter that you can then use. So if you use it down here, instead of writing click me, you would write it like this. In the curly brackets, you would add props, then dot title. So if I then here in the page.js give these buttons a different title like this, so title, button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, button 5, I'm basically passing the title as a props from the component and giving them different titles. So if I then look here, you can see that now it says button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, button 5. So that is how props works. So basically thanks to props, we can reuse a component but with a different output. So right now our page is a little bit boring because there's basically nothing happening when you click on the buttons, right? And in order to fix that, we will have to introduce first the notion of server and client components. So let's do it. So in React, we have something called a server component, which is the default, and then we have something called client components. And the difference is basically just when is the component rendered. So let's start with the server components. So in the case of a server component, so the client, you, me, go on the internet and go to any website with a server component. The server will then find that React component and basically compile that into HTML. So basically turn it into HTML on the server and then send back the HTML. So it is already HTML when it comes to the client. And again, server components are the default for any component you make in React. So if you don't specify anything here that you usually do in the top here, then it is a server component. If I wanted to make this into a client component, I would have to add use client like this, and now it is basically a client component. And for a client component, it works in a little bit of a different way. So the client, again, you, me, we go on the internet, then the server, instead of then compiling it into HTML, it sends back the page as a JavaScript page, and then on the client will turn it into HTML. So that is how a client component works. And in order to use all these cool features, like when you click on a button and so on, then you have to make a component client component. And now that our component is a client component, we then have access to different hooks and also the onClick. And the different hooks that we are going to be checking out is the useEffect and the useState, which are the two most used hooks in React. And we're also going to check out the onClick. Okay, so I remade the component a little bit now so that it's a little bit more fun. And first of all, you can see up here that it is a client component because I have the use client here. Then I'm also importing the two hooks, the useState and the useEffect from React. And by the way, useState is one of the most used hooks in React. And so we're using it twice here, as you can see, right? So we have a last clicked and we have a click count. And this is the way you basically write a state. So as you can see here, so we have a stateful variable here, and then we have a way to increase that state. So it is a function. And then you call the function here, and then you add the default here. So the default is 0, and down here the default is null. But the cool thing about using useState is that whenever we then call this function here, so either the set click count or the set last clicked, then React will automatically re-render the component whenever that is happening. So that is super cool. And then I have this useEffect hook here. So this useEffect runs changes. So every time a click count changes, then this one runs. So that's how you use this kind of hook. So you can see, first of all, there's a console log that fires. So that is just if you open in the browser the console, then you will see this firing. We'll do that in just a second. Then down here, we also have a function that is called handle click. And you can see that it sets two things in the state, which is the set click count up here. And it also sets the set last clicked as a date. And then it also fires a console log. And then down here in the return, we still have the button, and now we're using the onClick. So when you click, this is basically happening. So this function, so it's basically just in the onClick, we have the function here firing when clicking, and this is just CSS that we will get back to in a second. And we're displaying the title still. And then we also have this one, which is actually an if else. So if last clicked has a value, then display this. So if it has a value, then we're displaying last clicked and then the last clicked date basically. So So let's try and see what it looks like. So if I go here to our beautiful page, you can see that it now looks like this. So not that much change, but the cool thing is now I can actually click on the buttons. So if I click here, you can see now that it increased the number here. So now it has 1 click. If I click again, 2 clicks, 3 clicks, and you can also see down here that it adds the time that I clicked last time. So here it says 11:40. If I click again, 11:40:52, 11:40:54, and so on, right? If I then open the console and I go here to the console, again, I'm clicking on F12 to open this console. Then if I just clear it and let's try and click again, if I click down here, you can see that we have the console logs firing. So if I click again, you can see that it's firing and firing. So these are just the console logs that we have multiple places here in the useEffect. So that is why we see them there. And always remember to just use AI as much as possible here. So if there's something you are unsure about in this component, for instance, so let's say if you don't understand useState or useEffect or why we have the states here and so on, just ask the AI here, right? So again, you click up here to open it. So on this symbol here, you click here and then it opens up this chat box here. And then we ask, explain what is happening here in simple language. And then it's basically going to be explaining me what is happening here. So after a few seconds, you can see that it's explaining me everything, right? So that is how you have to start using AI all the time, not only for generating your components, but also for explaining you what is happening so that you start understanding more and more what is happening. Now for children, that is a React and also a Next concept that is kind of a special props that basically represents any content that is wrapped between the opening and the closing tags. So in this case, we are in the root layout that we will get back to in the next section. But basically here it represents all pages within the app folder. Now a map is like a loop that transformed a new array within the transformed elements, you could say. So now I added an example of a map here. So first of all, I added a new state up here, as you can see, click history, and then this function set click history. So basically every time we click on a button now, it will add this array where you see the click with an index +1. So every time it will increase by 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it will add the time of that click. So let's have a look. So if I click here, so as you can see, we have the last clicked and then the time here, but now we also have this new loop or this new array here, as you can see. So the click history, and then click 1 was at this time. If I click again, you see click 2 was at this time, and so on. So if I keep clicking, it will just add more and more to the array. So that is how the map works. Also, I now added the ternary operator again up here. Actually, we already learned about this in the JavaScript section, but as you can see here now, if last clicked exists, then it will add last clicked and then the last clicked, and the last clicked is the time, as you can see here. But if there's no last click, then it will just say no click yet. So let's see here. As you can see here, there's no clicks yet here and no clicks yet here. But if I click, then it will display the last clicked. Boom. And then you can see the last clicked here and also the loop here, as we were talking about just before. So that is the ternary operator. It's like a fancy if else basically. Now for template strings. So template strings is basically a feature that allows you to create strings with embedded expressions, you could say, right? So here in this console log, we are actually doing it. So as you can see, instead of using the double quotes here or the single quotes for adding a string or typing a string as you usually do it, we are using this backtick here. So this one, right? So this one. And that allows me then to add this one here. If I just added the normal double quotes like this, it will not allow me basically to do it this way. Then I cannot have this here. So I would have to then remove this one and then it would work. But if I want to have this here, then I have to use the backtick there like this. Great. So next up is Next.js, and Next.js is a React framework, and we are going to be using it mainly for organizing our pages. So we are going to be building React components, and we're going to be putting these components into pages.js because because we are building in JavaScript. We could also be building in TypeScript, but that is a little bit more advanced. So we are gonna be sticking with JavaScript, which is totally fine for building a marketplace. Next.js then in the background turns our JavaScript pages into HTML, and that is then being served to the clients on the internet. So that is why we are using Next.js. And again, I believe that these are the main concepts that we should know about in Next.js. There are of course many more, but these ones will get you really far. So that is why we will start with these ones. Okay, so let's have a look at a page.js. So a page.js is basically a file convention that you use whenever you want to make a page. And a page is like this. So this is a page that has these components inside it. So if I go back here to our page.js, so whenever you add a page.js, it is a page. And you can see here, it basically looks like a component. So we are exporting a default function as home, and then we have this return statement with different components inside it. So how do we make another page? Well, you always add all your pages in the app folder. So if you go to the app folder and then click on new folder and call it, for instance, dashboard, and then inside that new folder that you just made, you add a page.js, then you have a new page on the dashboard. So then if I go here and then I go to dashboard like this, then it will take me to that new page. But because we didn't add anything inside it, it gives me an error. So let's try and add something inside this page. Okay, so I now added something to our new page. I'm just writing dashboard, and then I'm adding some styling that we will get back to in a second. So let's go back and have a look at what it looks like. So if I go here now, and you can already see that now it just says dashboard here. Cool. And I can then go back to the other page that we have here. Okay, cool. So I just go back to dashboard again like this. Cool. Now that we know what a page is, what is then a layout? So you can see that we already have a layout here. So if I wanted to add something more to this layout, I could add a text in the top, for instance. So let's try and do that. So if I just add a div like this, and here I just write maybe, yeah, let's just write this. Peter is cool. Peter is cool. Cool. Let's see what that looks like. So if I go back to the page now, you can see that it says Peter is cool. And what we can also do is to make a specific layout for a specific page, for instance. So inside the dashboard folder where I have my page.js, I now added also a layout.js in here. And you can see that all I'm doing here is just to make the background red 500, which we'll learn about very soon. And if I then take a look, you can see that now the background is red here for the dashboard page. And let's also quickly talk about the link and the image from Next.js. So as you can see here on the page here, I added a link here and an image. And in the code, it basically looks like this. So I'm importing the link and the image up here, and then I'm using them down here. And the reason why it's cool to use the link is because Next.js will basically prefetch what page you link into, and the user experience will then be faster. So when you click on a link to another one of your pages, it will basically load very fast. So a very good user experience. And the images, when you use the image from Next.js, they basically optimize it automatically so that no matter what device you're on, it will load very fast. So let's say you have used a 2 megabyte image, Next.js will then still optimize it so that it doesn't take a long time to basically serve it to the client. And now let's move on to TailwindCSS. And again, TailwindCSS is a library that we use just to make CSS a little bit easier to apply basically. And if we go here to our package.json file, you can see that we already have Tailwind installed here, as you can see under the dependencies. And if I then go to our page.js here, you can see that we have all these class names with all this Tailwind CSS inside it. So basically Tailwind CSS is just an easier way to write CSS, because it would take us a long time to write CSS the old-fashioned way basically. So this just makes it much easier. And if I hover over this one, for instance, you can see what it is in old-fashioned CSS here, right? So you can see item center basically means align items center. Similarly, if I go to here flex, you can see that it means display flex. So already now you can see that it makes it much easier to write CSS this way. And by the way, if you don't see this when you hover, then you have to go to up here and then click on this one and then search for Tailwind CSS, and then you find this package basically, and then you just have to install it and then you will start seeing it. So in pure JavaScript we were writing class, but here in React we have to write class name. And so when React was created, they couldn't basically use class because that was already used by JavaScript, so they used class name to avoid any conflict basically. So that is why it is called class name in React. So let's jump straight into the example. So I changed our page here a little bit. We are still on our dashboard page where we can now see examples of how to use Tailwind, and the code is here. And let's first take a look at the code actually. So you can see here that we have all these ones, class names and then P8 and MB8 and all this stuff. What does it mean? Well, let's go through all the examples here. So text blue 600. So I guess it's almost self-explanatory. So if I asked text blue 600, basically makes the text blue, and you can see that up here the H1 here is blue, so we have the text blue 600 right here. Good. Similarly, if we added text gray 700, that would just make the text gray. And you can go here and click on colors. So if you just search for Tailwind CSS colors, you'll be able to see all the colors that they have here, and it goes from 50 up to 950, and that is from, you know, light up to dark of whatever color you chose. Cool. If you then add BG and then the color, that means that you change the background color. So this one, BG gray, means that it adds a light gray background. Now for borders and padding. So if you write border 2, that means that you add 2 pixels of border width. If you then write border red 500, that just adds a red border 500. So 500 is again just the color of the red. So we can find it here, and that is just the color red with a 500. So this one. If we add P4, it means that we add padding of 1 rem, which is 16 pixels on all sides. So that is also very useful. Instead of writing it for each side, so top, bottom, right, left, we just add P4, and that then adds padding all around it. For margins, we can add MB8, and that adds margin bottom of 32 pixels or 2 rem, some also call it. Or we could add MB4, which is just half, right? For flexbox, as we learned about earlier, so if you just add flex, that makes the container a flex container, and then we can add gap 4, which adds 16 pixels space between each flex item, like here. If we want to add rounded corners, we could do it like this. We just write rounded, or you can also add rounded minus LG, for instance, and then it's a little bit bigger, the border radius. And then down here you can see that this image here has a rounded border around it, right? So that's the basics of Tailwind. And also go ahead and search for Flexbox Tailwind CSS, and then you find some awesome guides on all the things you can do with Flex. That will take a long time to go through right here, so I'm gonna leave that to you to check out. And now DaisyUI is something you add on top of Tailwind, which makes it much easier to have cool looking buttons and so on. And there's a whole lot of stuff you can have a look at here. So for instance, here on the buttons, you can see that they have a lot of different buttons and so on, right? So if I, for instance, wanted to use this warning button here, I would basically just copy this one here, and then I can go to my component here, this page here, and then I would just change this one, for instance, to that warning button here, right? And then if we go and have a look, you can see that now we're using this warning button. So DaisyUI is really nice to use because it just makes it easier to make nice looking components. And one thing I just have to tell you is that you install it by first just typing this into your terminal. So just search for install DaisyUI, and then it will take you to this page. So you just copy this one and then paste it into your terminal like this, and then it will install the latest version. And then you also have to import it like this in your global CSS. So you just copy this, go to your global CSS, and then just paste it in here. And last but not least, you also have to go to your Tailwind config and then just add it here as a plugin, and then you are ready to use DaisyUI. Great, so now we made our first page. So no matter what you made, let's try and push it so that we can host it somewhere, and we're going to be hosting it on Vercel. So first of all, start out by going to your GitHub desktop, and then whatever you have made so far, let's just push it so that we can host it, and then you know how to host it somewhere. So go ahead and push it. So I'm just gonna write something here like small changes, and then I'm just gonna commit this to development first. So I'm pushing it, and then I'll click here again to create a pull request from development into the main. So, and then I have to click here. Boom. So now it is updated with the latest changes. Then in order to host it, so we need to host our page somewhere. And for that, I'm going to be using Vercel, basically because I use Vercel for all my projects. And Vercel is actually the company behind Next.js. And I'm not associated to Vercel in any ways. I just like their service basically. So this is how you are going to be doing it. And by the way, you can also use other platforms out there for hosting your projects. There's one called Render, for instance, that you can also use for it. So, but we're going to be using Vercel now. So go to Vercel and then click on sign up, and then just click that you are a hobby for now at least, and then you just add your name, and then you have to connect your GitHub account. So let's go ahead and do that. So then you add your details here, and then you should see all your projects here. Right now you're probably only gonna be seeing the one that you made, but then click on this import here to import it. And actually, just before we do that, I just want to change my name from example to something else. So let's just do that. So I go here to desktop, and I then go to view on GitHub, and then I see this page here. So if I then go to settings, come join me, and that is it. So now it is renamed to come join me. If I then go back here and refresh, you can see that now it says come join me. So I'm just gonna be importing that one on Vercel now. And then here, don't change anything here. Just basically click on the deploy here, and then it will deploy it. And we'll get back to how this actually works afterwards. So just click on deploy, and then it starts deploying. And if you click down here on the build logs, you can see what is happening here. So it's basically building. So you can see here Washington, that's where the server is going to be, at least for me. And you can see that it's been basically building, and now it says congratulations. So cool. So our project is live here, and then you just click on continue to dashboard. And then if you go here and click on visit, you can see that we have our web page live now here on this page here. And you can see that it is using a subdomain for the page, right? So Vercel, so come join me.vercel.app. Cool. So now you can basically send this one to anyone that you would like, and they would be able to see it, and it is live on the internet. Congratulations. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about what is actually happening here on the background. So we were on our computer, we were committing and then pushing some changes that we were pushing to GitHub, which is like a Google Drive for our code. But we had also connected Vercel to our GitHub, meaning that whenever we make some changes and we push them to GitHub, Vercel will basically listen for those new updates, and then they will basically do two things. They will do what is called a npm run build and an npm run start. So an npm run build will basically create a bundle of all your pages, and the npm run start will kind of start a development server on Vercel, similar to the npm run dev that we are doing all the time on our local environment. But on the local environment, it's a little bit different, because there are some special things that, for instance, if you do a save, it will update it automatically so that you can see the changes that you make all the time. So if I go to our project here, you can see that we have these scripts here. So the npm run dev, we already talked about that one, and we are using that one all the time. But then you can see the build and the start right here. And we can actually do that in our project here. So if I close our dev environment here, and if I just do an npm run build, it will build an optimized version of our project here. So that will take a little bit of time, and you don't have to do it along with me. I just want you to basically see what it looks like. So now it has done the build, and now you can see up here we have this .next folder, and this is basically the bundled version of our project, and that is what Vercel does just on the server. And now I can also do an npm run start, which will then start a server similar to the npm run dev. But if I now make some changes, so if I go here, for instance, and make some changes in the page here, so if I remove this button, for instance, then you can see that it is actually not being removed, right? So you can see, even though I make some changes here, let me remove all the buttons here, like this, nothing is changing here. That is because it is using the bundled version up here, and it is not updating all the time as it is when we are using the npm run dev. And sometimes it can be useful to do an npm run build and then an npm run start before you push to GitHub, just to be sure how it actually looks in the production environment. So using the npm run build and then the npm run start, it basically is a smart thing to do sometimes to just check how it looks in production. Great, and now we need to buy a domain name for our upcoming marketplace. And I would recommend you also buying a domain name. Any domain name would be fine. It's just because we will be using that domain name further on in this course, for instance when we are setting up email and so on. So let's buy a domain name. Cool. And by the way, so if you don't know yet what your marketplace will be all about, you can also just buy a domain name anyway that you will be using. So it could, for instance, be your own name for your domain name. You could just buy that one that you might anyway be using, and then you can later on buy the actual domain name for the marketplace that you're building when you know exactly what you are going to be building. But let's go ahead and buy one. So I'm gonna be buying mine here on one.com, which is the one that I usually use, but you could also buy it on GoDaddy, or I think there's one called Namecheap as well. There are many out there, but I like this one called one.com, so that's the one I will be using. So go ahead and create an account and then log in, and then it will look a little bit like this, right? So here I can see all the domain names that I have here, and I'm now gonna be buying a new domain name here. And I had a fun idea for my domain name, so I'm gonna be buying this domain name, comejoinmehere.com, which is an idea for a marketplace kind of similar to meetup.com. So let's see if it is available, and let's see, it is available. And you can see that it's relatively cheap. It's 105. I think this is either Danish or Norwegian crowns, but usually it's around $10 per year. So actually you have to pay per year. So you only have it on a yearly basis. So you're basically kind of renting it, right? So every year you have to pay the $10. So yeah, that's how it is, just so you know. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you buy a .com or a .no or .eu or whatever kind of TLD it's called. So any TLD will work. So just go ahead and buy one that fits your marketplace and your needs. So for instance, if you are only operating in, let's say in Portugal, then you should probably buy a .pt TLD. Okay, yeah, so go ahead and buy a domain, and then I will see you on the other side. Oh, and by the way, you should not buy anything extra here, right? So you only need the domain, nothing else, right? So if it asks for you for some kind of a hosting plan or email essential or whatever, don't buy that. You only need the domain, nothing else. Great, and now that you bought a domain name, then click here and pick the one that you just bought, and then scroll down here to DNS settings and click on that one. And if you bought your domain name on another provider like GoDaddy, then you will still have access to the DNS settings. You just have to figure out where they are. But click then on the DNS settings and then go to DNS records. Because what we will now do is that we will connect our new domain name to Vercel, where we are hosting our project. So now let's go to Vercel and click on the new project that we have, and then up here in the settings, go down to domains, and you can see that we have it here on comejoinme.vercel.app. So click here on add domain, and then we basically add our domain here. So we basically write the domain name, right? So we go here and then just copy paste that one to be 100% sure, and then we add it here like this and click on add domain. And then it asks us if it should be for production, and yes, we will add it for the production environment, and click save. And then it says domain added to project, but you can see here that it then says that we have to add these DNS records. So basically what you do is just you copy paste this one, right? So first of all, actually let's do the A record. So then we go back to one.com and go here to A, and then just paste this in. Sorry, not that. So this one is the name, so the name here, and then it will point to this one, so point to that one. And then this one we can just leave blank. It will then choose the default. So we then click create record, and then we go back and also do the same for the CNAME one. So we have to do the www, add that here as a CNAME, so put that there, and then this one we copy that one and paste that one in there. And we have to remove the dot there in the end. So we create the record, and that is it. So now we then just have to click here on I've added my records, and then we have to wait a little bit because it is then generating the SSL certificates. So let's see, this can take a couple of seconds, maybe even a minute or two. So let's wait a little bit. And now you can see that it is configured correctly. So we close, and there's something here. We can see that there's something wrong here. Let's click on reconfigure. I think we just have to wait a little bit here as well because we already added this, right? So let's also wait a little bit. And now you can see that that one is also configured correctly. Awesome. So what this means is that now we can basically go here to comejoinmehere.com, and then we will see our web page. So let's try and do it. So if I copy paste this one and go there, you can see that our web page is now here. Congratulations, you just connected your domain that you just bought to Vercel so that you can now see it online on that domain. Great job. And just again, the way it works here is that you, as the client, you go on your browser and then you type in the domain that you just bought. Then there's something called DNS. So the DNS turns what you entered into an IP address. So see it as a phone book where you look in the phone book and then you find the domain and then the connected IP address. And that IP address is then connected to a server, and in our instance is the Vercel server now. And then the Vercel server returns the page to the browser. So that is how it works basically. And just a couple of things we didn't really talk about before, right? So when you buy a domain, then you also own all the subdomains that you would like to add, right? So if you wanted to add a subdomain here, for instance, like blog.comejoinmehere.com, that is a subdomain. So you would own all subdomains for your domain as well. So that comes automatically when you buy a domain. And the different types of DNS records there are, right? So when you buy a domain, you can edit the DNS records, which are used to map requests to a specific type of database, right? And there are 4 types that you should know about, and we just added some of them just before, as you saw, right? So first of all, there's the A record, which basically maps a domain name to an IP address. Then there's the CNAME record that basically maps domain aliases to another domain name, not an IP. So that's what we did for the www. Then there's MX records, which is used for emails, so it directs emails to the right server basically. And then there's the TXT record, which basically stores text information. So we will be using that when we, for instance, has to verify Google Analytics so that it knows that we are the owner of the domain. So those are the most important types you should know about. And I also just want to talk about SSL. So SSL stands for Secure Socket Layer, and you saw just before when we added our domain on Vercel, Vercel issued a SSL certificate for us. So that's why I just want to tell you about it. So the way it works is that you visit a website, and then that website sends back some kind of digital certificate, you could say. Your browser then checks that certificate, and if all is good, a secure connection is then made, which is also called a handshake. And that digital certificate is issued by Vercel in our instance, so they are the ones issuing that secure socket layer. So that is how SSL works. Great guys, so now we know how to basically make static pages. So we know how to code in React, Next.js, we know how to style it using Tailwind and DaisyUI sometimes. We also know how to deploy our sites on Vercel, and we know how to get a domain name and set up the DNS settings. So everything now we've been doing is basically on the what we call the front end. So now we have to move down to what we call the backend, and that is basically everything that is happening that you can't see as a user. So for instance, if you click a button, then maybe you update the database, and that is happening on what we call the backend. Also, if we wanted to maybe call an API, the OpenAI API or a similar API, that would also be happening on the backend. And in order for the front end to communicate with the backend, we will have to set up what we call an API endpoint. And an API endpoint is basically like creating a small door on our server so that our front end can communicate communicate with our backend. So we will go through the main concepts of making an API endpoint on the server, and then we will also go through how to then communicate with the endpoint on the front end. When, for instance, you click a button and you then want something to happen, you then call the endpoint and then something happens. Okay, so let's just go a little bit deeper in what an API actually is. So every time you go on the internet and do stuff, like for instance here on You're My Star, if I create a new star here and click down here on save, then I'm basically making a post request to the API endpoint that I made for creating this new star in the database. So you could say that an API is basically a generic term where in the server you've opened up specific doors so that you can perform specific actions on the server, and that way you can from the front end communicate with the back end and do certain stuff. And there are then different kinds of requests you can make. So the most used one is the get request, where you basically get information back. Then there's the post, where you send some information, and then there's the patch, which is basically an update information, and then there's the delete, which is kind of self-explanatory. And the server does not necessarily have to send HTML back, as in this example here. It could also be an image or a video, for instance. So it is not always just HTML that is sent back. And then in this example here, as you can see here, I've actually written update here. So maybe a better example would be first a post where you send user info. So maybe it's for creating a new user in the database. So you're sending a post request. And then later on, let's say the user would like to update their user information, maybe the username or something like that. Then you can make an API endpoint, which would be update user info, and that would then be a patch request. And just remember that a server can also communicate with another server. So for instance, the MongoDB server, and that is also done via API endpoints. So MongoDB, they also have a lot of API endpoints so that you can communicate with their server. And when we are then sending a MongoDB URI string and our request, then the server, our server, is sending that to the MongoDB endpoint. And because we're sending the MongoDB UI string and the request, then our server is communicating with the MongoDB server that way. So as an example, if we go to You're My Star here and click on the F12 again to open up the console here, and then if you click on the network tab here, and if I do something, so let's say I want to create a new star here, right? So create a new star, this one Stellar Shine, let's just call it that, and then we save the star. And let me just clear the network tab here. So if I then save a star, you can see that there's something happening here, right? And if I then click here, you can then see that this was a post request we were sending to, let me just make it a little bit bigger here, to this endpoint here, which is an API endpoint, as you can see here, and it's located at yourmystar.com/API, and then I've called this one a save drawn star. So that is an API endpoint, and you can see that we're getting the status code 200 back that I'll explain in just a second. But if you then click here on payload, you can see what we were sending. So first of all, we were sending an image, as you can see here. Then we were sending the description, and we were sending the name. And if you click here on preview and on response, you can see that we basically received back from the API. So we received a success true, and then we received this information. So the star, basically we are receiving the star document that was also put in the MongoDB database back here, you can see, right? So all the information, when it was created, when it was updated, price, dedication, there was no dedication, the image, and that is located, you can see, on Cloudinary, the name, the description, created by, and this created by is a Clerk user ID that we will also get back to later. And then this ID is a unique ID that MongoDB makes for all the documents they add in the database. So that is a MongoDB ID, and you can see it has this underscore ID here. Preview is actually just a different way of seeing the same information that I just went through. And if we then go back here to the headers, again we receive this 200 OK. A 200 OK is basically an HTTP response that when you make your API endpoints, you basically tell what status codes to send back in case certain things happen. And the 200 is a status code that basically means that everything went fine. If you just search for HTTP response status codes, you can see that there's all this information here about them. And you can see the successful responses. There's the 200 OK, the request succeeded. So that is the most common one to pretty much always send back. And then what you usually also send back in case something goes wrong, then you have a 500. So let's just try and find the 500 here. So here it is. If something goes wrong, then you send a 500 back so that you know then that something went wrong. And there are many different status codes, but the most used ones are the 200 and the 500, and then also the 404 if something was not found, maybe a user, and also the 400, which is a bad request, and actually also the 401 if it's an unauthorized request that was made. So maybe you're making a request, but in order to make that request, you will have to be logged in, for instance. So for instance, let's say I try and go into a protected area on a user's dashboard, for instance, but I'm not logged in as that user. Then the API endpoint would send back usually a 401 so that you know that, okay, you actually reached the endpoint, but you are not authorized to see what you want to try and take a look at. And by the way, these HTTP response status codes here, right? So that is not something that comes automatically if you maybe thought that, because that is something that you as the developer put in your code. So the reason why it returns a 200 here is because I added it as the response code that it should send, right? And also the 500 in case something goes wrong, that is also something that I've added. So all these response codes, so that is something that the developer adds to their codes, to their endpoints basically. So let's actually look at this example here. So if I pull up my code, then let's try and go through this API endpoint. So just so you have an idea of what it looks like. So this is my you're my star route here. This is TypeScript though, but it's almost the same as JavaScript. So there are some small differences. So basically the difference is that every time there's a type, I have to basically define what type it is. So let's try and go through it, right? So first of all, you can see that in my app folder here, I've added an API folder. So in Next.js, that is the way you have to do it, right? So you have to add all your API endpoints in the API folder. So you basically just make an API folder and then add all your endpoints in there. So if I open it, you can see all these ones are API endpoints. And what you then also have to do, you can see here if I go to the save drawn star folder. So the name of the folder will then be the name that you have to basically call here, right? So as you can see here, API save drawn star, that is because the folder name is save drawn star. And what you then have to do, you have to call it either route.ts or route.js. And we are going to be doing it in JS, right? So in JavaScript. So, but just quickly to go through this endpoint here, right? So first of all, you can see what is happening here. First of all, you can see that it is a post. As you could also see here, it is a post. So we're basically sending some data. And you can then see that first what it is doing is that it is finding out if this user who is doing it is actually authorized to do it, right? So if he's basically logged in. So, and if there's no user ID found, then we're basically sending back the 401 here, the 401 status code again, which is the one that is for unauthorized. So the reason why we then add the 401 is basically just to make it easier then to understand that, okay, you basically hit the right endpoint, but you are not authorized to do whatever you try to do. And in this case, it's actually if you're not logged in, then you have to first log in and then you can create the star. If we then go back, you can see that it is then getting all this data here. So all this data, the data URL, the name, the description and dedication. If there is no data URL, no name or no description, then it is sending back a 400 where it says missing required fields. So these fields are required in this request. And the data URL is actually the picture, the image of the star, and the name is the title again. So if we go back here and look at the payload, you can see the data URL is the image and the description is the description of the star and the name is basically the name of the star or the title of the star. Then we go back here. Then you can see that if all of that is fine, then it's basically, first of all, we are defining the upload folder where we want to basically save the star image. And if we're in production mode, then it is in this one. And if we are not in production mode, then it is in development one, right? So you can see see that it's just a ternary operator here, where if production, then save here, if not production, then save in the development one, right? And then we are basically defining the upload folder on Cloudinary, and we are connecting to the database here, and then we're basically creating the star document, and the star document is then consisting of these fields here, right? So they're created by the name, the description, the image, the created ad, the updated ad, and the price. And the price, as you can see here, is set to default 100, and then the dedication. And in the end, we're basically saving the star, and then we're doing some revalidation of the cache. But down here, you can then see that afterwards, we're then sending back, so we're returning to the front end a success true, first of all. And by the way, the default here is then a 200. So we don't actually have to say that it's a status 200. If we don't specify it, then it is a 200. And then you can see we are sending the star, all the star information back here. And that's what you were seeing right here in the response, right? So we have the success true, and then all the star information here. And all that star information is what we made up here in the variable here, right? And you can then also see down here that if something goes wrong, we're basically sending back a status 500. And what is this try catch here, right? So you can see all the way up here in the beginning, we have this try, and then we have the catch down here. It's kind of like an if else, right? So if all goes wrong, do this, but if something goes wrong, you then catch it and then kind of send an error message back instead. And that is something that developers do all the time, because writing code is quite complicated, and it's quite normal sometimes to have some kind of error, and you then want to handle that error gracefully, and that is why you want to catch it like this and then just send back a status code instead of the whole application just going down. You then want to catch that error and send back a status code, and then with a 500, so that the user knows that, okay, something went wrong. And by the way, on the front end, I have this hero client, which is basically this one, this part up here, where you can see that this model is placed. This is where I'm generating the stars and also saving them. So if we go back to the code, you can see here that I'm then calling the route here this way. So I have an await fetch here, and then API / save drawn star, which is this route that we just went through. And you can then see this is where I'm sending the data in a JSON format. So the data URL, the name and the description, the data URL again was the image. And then you can see down here that if everything goes well, then I'm showing some confetti, which is just an NPM package for showing some kind of firework, and then I'm sending back a success message if everything goes well. And this is the firework I was talking about. So if I go in here and then just generate a star and save it, then you should be able to see some firework firing right now, this one, right? And that one is basically just this package on NPM. So this one called Canvas Confetti that you can just install, and then there are different ways you can use it. Super cool package. Okay, so let's go ahead and make our first API endpoint. And again, I am in our project, the one I'm calling Join Me, Come Join Me. And I have actually already gone ahead and made a super simple API endpoint, as you can see here. But just before we go through that one, I have placed it inside the app folder, and then I made the folder called API. You have to do that in Next.js. So go ahead and make an API folder within the app folder, and then call the endpoint that you want to make now together with me. Call it whatever you want, but that is what the endpoint is then called. So I made a folder inside the API folder now, just called hello, and then I made a route.js inside that hello folder, and you have to call it route.js. So all your routes again will be inside the API folder, and so you make folders inside the API folders, and then inside each folder you have the route.js. Cool. Now you can see this endpoint here. It is super simple. So first of all, I'm exporting it, and then I'm using the async keyword here. So there are two keywords that you then can use. You can use the async and the await keyword further down. So if you want to await for something, then you can add something like this, for instance, const data, and then await for this to happen, right? Let's say we had a function called fetch from database, and we were defining that function further up. Then then it would await for this before moving further down. And you can then see I made this a get request, and inside it I'm only doing one thing. I'm console logging API endpoint was called, and I'm then also returning this response, and you can see that the response is just a helper. So instead of writing all this, you basically can just write response like this, and then I'm returning this message hello from the API. So let's see what it looks like. So if I go to the front end, then again I have to then think about it. Where do I have to go now? I have to go to the API folder and then to hello. So let's try and do it. So if I write here API and then again /hello and click enter, boom, you can see the message that we are then console logging here. And if I open F12 and go to the network tab here and refresh, you can also see it here, right? So basically it's a get request to this request URL, and it's returning a 200. And the reason why it's a 200 is because we didn't define it here. So the default again is a 200, and the response is then this message. So congratulations, you just made your first API endpoint, and we are returning the response object that contains JSON data, more specifically this data. Oh, and one more thing I just forgot to say is that because this is happening on the server, so on our development server, then this console log will be firing on the server, so we will be able to see it down here in the terminal. So if I go again to our page and refresh and then go back to the terminal, I can see it was firing right here. API endpoint was called, which is this one, right? So yeah, just so you know, so because this is firing on the server, that is why you will see it down here then. So if I had made something similar with a console log on a client component on the front end, then I would be able to see it on the console here. But because this is firing on the server, we will see it in the terminal down here. And here's an example where we are using the await keyword here. So again, in order to use the await keyword, you also have to then add the async. So you cannot add the await without having the async up here. Cool, so let's go through it. So first of all, we have a console log firing here, starting the function. Then we have this one here, which is a variable, and you can see that it has a promise here. So a promise is an object that represents a value that we don't have yet. And then we have this one here, which is a parameter, which is the result, which is a JavaScript function that we can call to resolve a promise. So let's go through it. So here it says console log promise created, starting timer. So this console log is firing, waits for that before it basically does something. So in this instance, it is set to 4000 milliseconds, which is 4 seconds. So I could also set it to 3 seconds like this. Then down here we have a console log saying about to wait for the promise. Then we have the await, and then we have a last console log promise result continuing. So if I go here and refresh, you can see that it takes some time now. And then let's go back and have a look here. So what is happening here? So first, the console log number 1 is firing. It's firing here. Then we have number 2 firing here, the promise created, starting a timer. But then because we have this set timeout here, we actually see number 4 firing then, this one, about to wait for the promise. And then we have the await here. And because this console log is inside this set timeout, it will wait for 3 seconds before this one fires. So you can see then number 3 is here, timer finished, calling resolve. And then in the very end, we have the console log 5, which is saying promise resolved continuing. So again, because we have the await here, it will not move on before this one is basically finished, before it is resolved. So that is why it is waiting until this one is done, until it moves on to console log 5. Okay, and if we then change our handle click here on the button with counter, which is again used here in the page.js. So here we're calling the button with counter, as you can see here. So as you can see then here in the button with counter, we now have a handle click, and that one is being called down here when we click on something. So as you can see here, we then have the await fetch here, and the fetch is a built-in JavaScript function that is used to make HTTP requests. And you can see that we are then writing here API/API/hello to call the API endpoint that we made. And the API endpoint is now made much more simple. So it's basically just console logging first one hello, and then it's returning this response object in a JSON format with the message hello from the API and a timestamp, and then also the status success, and then also a data object where it says button clicked true, and then the server time. So let's try and have a look what it looks like. So if I then go to the front end here, I clear this console here, and if I click here now, so here you can see, if I then click down here, you can see what we are sending back here, right? So this information here. So there's the message, there's the status, and there's the timestamp. And there's also this data object where it says button clicked true and the server time. And I can click again, and then we see it again here, right? And by the way, these console logs here, they are just coming from here. So here, the console logs from up here, right? But there you can see we're basically communicating with our API, and it's sending back information, and then we're console logging that information that we're getting back from the API here. Const data await response JSON, and then we're console logging the data. Great, and just a quick thing here, instead of just using the response in Next.js, you would usually use the next response that you import like this from next server, and then return it similar to a normal response. And the reason why you would use the next response is just because it basically handles cookies and headers a little bit better. So that's why you would usually use the next response object instead of the normal response object. And by the way, often you use query parameters to basically add something to the URL that can then be used later, maybe on an API endpoint or similar. So it could be something like this, where I add something in the end. I could add Rasmus, and then you can see that it would be added after the question mark and a Q that I just added here, and then equal Rasmus. So that's the query parameter. And as you can then see here on this page, I'm then using use search params from next navigation to basically get the search params down here. So you can see that get the current search params from the URL. I'm then using the search param from up here to get everything that is after the queue, basically. And now that you know what APIs are and how they work, then I really encourage you to have a look at some of the cool APIs, like for instance the OpenAI one, right? So it's relatively simple to start using them, basically. So of course you have to then first make an account, so you get an API key. But once you've done that, they have some really good documentation on how to basically start using it. And imagine the many ways you can use it, right? So if you, for instance, have some data, you can send it to OpenAI to analyze it and then give you back an image or whatever, right? Or some better text. There's so many different ways you can use the OpenAI API. So really go and check that out. Similarly, you can also go and check out the Twitter one that is called Grok. They also have a good documentation, so go out and check that one out. And yeah, just play around with it, because you will learn so much and you can do so many cool things with these kind of APIs. So now that we know what APIs are and we can make our own ones, then let's move on to databases, because no matter what you build, what kind of marketplace, then you will need some kind of database at some point for storing data, because that's what databases are used for. And to begin with, we can talk a little bit about the architecture. So usually what is good before you start building your database is to have some kind of overview of what you're going to be building, so that you know what kind of models you are going to be using, and also how these models will communicate with each other. So you're probably going to have users, maybe you're going to have messages, you're going to have listings, and how are these interacting with each other. That's usually what is meant with the architecture. And the thing is, it can sometimes be difficult, right? Because on the way, as you start building, you might come up with something that you want to change, and something that you didn't think about in the beginning, and then you adjust your schemas and your models. And I think that's quite normal, right? Because you cannot think about everything before you start building. It's normal as you build, maybe you get some additional ideas that you then also want to add to your marketplace, but that means that you will then have to adjust your models a little bit. But it's still good to have an overall view, an overall idea of what your architecture will be before you start building. And a schema defines the structure of the data, whereas a model represents the data, you could say. So in this example here in You Are My Star, where I have the user model here, you could say that all this up here is the schema, where I'm basically defining the structure of the data, and then all the way down here you have the model, which is the constructor, you could say, that then represents the data. So that's the difference between the schema and the model. Now in this course we are going to be using a NoSQL database. We're going to be using MongoDB, but let's just quickly talk about the difference between an SQL and a NoSQL database. Now actually before that, let's just quickly look at this one. Okay, so first of all, if you as the client go somewhere on some domain, and maybe you get your user info, you log in and then you go to your user info. Then you're communicating with a server, and then that server is then using the connection string, if you're using MongoDB at least, to communicate with the server to get that information for that user that is stored in the database. And then on the server, once they've gotten that information back, they then prepare the data and send it back as an HTML page to the client. So you always communicate first with your server, and then there is the server that it communicates with the database. And the database is only used for storing the database. It's not used for anything else. And the way you connect to it is via some kind of key. And in MongoDB, it is the connection string that we're using. And when we are in our development environment and therefore using a local development server, then we are still just communicating with the database from the local server. And when we push to production, we are then using the Vercel infrastructure, but there's not much difference then. It's still the API routes that we wrote that are now on Vercel that are communicating with the database using the connection string. And there are two types of databases. There is the SQL database and the NoSQL database. And SQL stands for Structured Query Language. So in a SQL database, data is stored in a table with rows and columns, whereas in a NoSQL database, data is stored in kind of like a JSON format structure. And the main difference between these two databases is that in a NoSQL database, you do not have to have each document being the same. So for instance here, if this city was not there, so if I do like this, so let's say that one is not there, it will still work totally fine. Like it's totally fine to have different documents, you call them. So this is document, this is another document. That's totally fine. They don't have to have the same structure. Whereas in an SQL database, they all have to have the same structure. So therefore, a NoSQL database is usually considered to be more flexible. And in a MongoDB database, this is the naming structure you use. So each input, you could say, is a document. So every time there is, for instance, a new user, that's a new document. And then all the users, that's a collection. And you can have multiple collections, of course. So you can also have a stars collection, and you can have as many collections as you want. But then each input, so each star in this example, would then be a document. Great. So now let's go and set up MongoDB. So go to mongodb.com and then click on the Get Started. And then add all your details here and click on create your Atlas account. Great. And then once you've done that, then it should look somewhat like this. So find where it says create a cluster and then create one. And then instead of all this, go on the free one and just call it something. So just call it maybe the name of your idea for your marketplace, or you can basically call it whatever you want. So I'm just gonna call this one Come Join Me. And we do not want to preload a sample data set, so untick that one. Provider is fine with AWS, and the region, actually it's best to choose one in North America because that's where Vercel is also hosting our server. So let's choose one in North America and then just click on create deployment. Cool. You can then see here that you get some information here. So you get a username and a password. So the username, just add something here. So I'm just gonna add Rasmus and then copy the password so you store it somewhere, and then click on create database user and then choose a connection method. And once you're then here, click on compass, and then you can see your connection string down here. So the connection string is what we're going to be using to communicate with our database. So this one, copy paste that one, and don't worry if you forget it at some point, because you can always just log into MongoDB and then find it again here. But this actually takes us to what we call the .env folder. So let me just explain that one. So if we go to our project and we then here in the root folder make a new file called .env, this file is meant for something that we want to store to communicate with our database, but also with maybe other API keys we could store in here and so on. And we are not going to be pushing this one to GitHub. So that's why we stored in this .env. And you can see here in our gitignore, it is basically saying down here that this one is not going to be committed when we push. So it's basically a safe kind of file where we have all our passwords that we then store here in this file. And the way you usually store the MongoDB URI is to write like this. You always write capital, by the way, here, then the string. So let me just go back and copy the string here and copy it back in here. And then I save, and then we have it here. The way it is structured here is that it always says MongoDB plus srv, and then you have the username, and this then is my password, and then you have this in the end here. And then what you usually write in the end here is, because you want to have both a database for the development and for the production environment, then what I usually do is that I write something like development here, and then I would do the same on Vercel. So if I then go to Vercel, and I go into the project here and then go to settings, then you can see down here that we have these environment variables. Then I would paste this one in here. So I would paste this one. So this is the key and the value is then the string here. So I copy paste that one in here. But in the end here, I don't want to write development here because this is then for the production, right? So here we write production instead. Good. And then we save it. So now, as you can see, we're using the development database when we are in our local server and in our development environment where we can mess everything up. And then on production, on Vercel, we're using the production database. That's how most developers do it. And one more thing we just have to do here is to click on the network access and then edit, click on edit here, and then click on allow access from anywhere and click confirm. And this does not mean that everyone now can access our database. You will still need the string, the username, the password, and so on. But doing it this way just makes it easier for us if we want to work, for instance, from a cafe where I will have another IP address. Then I do not have to then first go here to MongoDB and add that IP address in order to access the database. And also when you push to production, we're not 100% sure what IP addresses Vercel are using. So this just makes it much easier and it's still safe to do it this way. And now if you haven't already, then go ahead and download MongoDB Compass. You can just search for it and then just click here and then download this one. And there is a version both for Mac and for Windows. So here you can see that I think it identifies that I'm on a Mac, but just download either the Mac version or the Windows version and install it. And once you've done that, then try and open it up and it should look somewhat like this. So here you can then click on the add new connection and here you just copy paste the new string that we got here. So copy paste this one in here and click on save, and then you should see it somewhere here. So right now we actually don't have anything in our database, so let's just try and add something in the database. So let's go back here to here and go to the cluster and here click on browse collection and click on add something, and let's add a user. And let's insert a document. So we're just gonna add something here. So something like name Rasmus, and maybe also username Ninja Turtle, and then also the eye color. Let's add the eye color and we write blue here and insert, and now we inserted our first document. Now let's go back to MongoDB Compass, and if I click here and I refresh the database, I can now see our user here. So if I click on user and then on user, you can see that I have the first document inserted here with this information. What I can also do is that I can query for something up here. And actually, if I write eye color and then blue, then it finds it. But if I say red here, it of course does not find it. And I can also write something like name Rasmus, and then it should find it. Yep. And what you can also do is to use their AI here to basically generate the query. So if I just write something like all users with eye color red, then it should generate the query here, and you can see that it does that, and then you can find and you find no one, right? But if I change this to blue, then it basically changes here and then I can find it again. So that's a very easy way to basically generate your queries here to finding something in your database. And actually one mistake I made here is that here I should have probably just called this one development or something similar, right? So if I go ahead and delete this one and drop that one, drop the whole one, and then here if I add some data again here and call this one development, and then the collection name could be user, and then create, and then again add a document, then I have the document in here in the development database. And now if I go back here, it makes a little bit more sense, right? So if I go here and refresh, then you can see I have the development one here with a user inside it. So that makes more sense. So you then have the development database and then later on the production database. And by the way, this admin here and this config, that is nothing that you have to worry about, so just leave that as it is. And similar to the local one here, that that is also something that MongoDB adds by default, so also don't worry about that one. And now to connect to our MongoDB database from our environment, we have to install what is called a MongoDB Node.js driver, which is basically a bridge between our MongoDB database and our backend. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we open up the code here and then go down here in the terminal, and basically what we just have to write is npm install MongoDB. So let's do that, and now it is installed, as you can see here then in the package.json. Cool. And then usually you make a function that connects to your database. So let's go ahead and do that, and let's place that in the libs folder. That's what you usually make, or you can also make a utils, which stands for utility folder, in the root, right? So let's just make a libs. So I make a libs, and then inside this one I'll make the connect mongo, and then I paste this function in here, which is dependent on this library up here, as you can see. So let's also just install this one, which is called the mongoose. So let's just install that one as well. So npm I mongoose and install that one. And you can see here that what it basically just does is that first of all we have an if else here. So if we have the string in our .env, so this one, then it moves on. If it is not there, then it basically just throws this error. And by the way, you see this process.env.mongodb URI. The process.env is basically a Node.js object that we can use to basically access the .env file. So whenever we need to get something from the .env file, we use this process.env way of doing it. And basically we can try and then console log that somewhere. So if we go to our page here and then maybe just add it down here like this, in a console log like this, then we will see it firing down here in the terminal, because this is a server component right now, because we haven't added the use client up here. So this page.js is also a server component right now. So let's see. So if I save it, you see it firing down here. So the string is right here. You would never do this, of course, but you can see that it is actually possible here. And by the way, so if we then add the use client up here, so now it is a client component, but right now we would not see this one firing on the front end. So if I go to the front end and just refresh, as you can see here, it says undefined here. And that is because in Next.js, if you want access to an environment variable on the client, then you have to rename them with this in front, right? So next public in front. So if we rename it to this, like this, and then go back here and then change that one, and it is still a client component, now we should see it firing in the browser on the front end here. So let's have a look, and you can see that it is here. So that is how it works. And I will just change it back to how it was before, like this. And I will remove this console log, because you should never console log your MongoDB URI, of course. Good, and now let's just go back to the function here. So again, so first of all, it checks for that string in the .env, and if it's not there, then it throws this error basically. And then all it just does is that it awaits for Mongoose to basically connect to the database. And then if anything happens, if anything goes wrong, then it throws an error down here. So down here, it's inside a try catch, as you can see. That's all it does. And that one we will use every time we then connect to our MongoDB database. And by the way, you could make this one much more advanced, of course, but this one will for sure work. So let's go ahead and try and use it. Great, so I'm just back here in our route.js for the hello. And just remember that this one is being called down here in the button with counter, which we are using here on the front page. So every time I click on a button, then it's basically calling that route here, as you can see, API hello. Okay, and what is it doing then? It's not doing much right now. So I'm just importing the function here, connect Mongo, and then I'm basically connecting to our database. And if everything goes well, it's just firing this console log here, MongoDB connected successful. So basically, if I go here and click, then you can see I'm actually getting an API response here with MongoDB connected successfully. And down here, I'm also seeing that it says starting the function, that is this one. And then after we have connected, it says MongoDB connected successfully. And the reason why we see this message here on the button with counter, you can see that we have this one, right? So we are waiting the response, and then we are console logging the API response and then the data. And that is the reason why we see this in the console here. But we could also go to the network tab, and you can see the same response here. And here you can also see that it's returning a 200. We're calling the hello, and the payload was button 1, and the response is message MongoDB connected successfully. Okay, and let's just try and add something in the database when we do something. So for instance, instance, when we click on one of the buttons, right? So I created this model up here. So we're defining the schema here, and then we have the model here, right? So that is basically how you do it, right? So you can see that the button number here is of type number, and it's a required field. And then we also have the date when it is clicked at. And if we now check the button width counter and check the handle click here, you can see that I changed it now. So we are actually sending some information to the route here, right? So first of all, you can see that it is a post request, and I now have this body here, right, where I'm adding the button number, and the button number I'm getting from the page here, right? So when you click on button 1 here, we're sending button number 1, 2, and so on, right? And if I then go to the route here, you can then see that we are importing the model that we just went through just before. So we're basically creating a document in the database whenever a button is clicked, right? And the information that will go into the database is basically this information. Okay, so let's try and see if it works, right? So if I go then to the front end here, and let me just clear this one, and let's try and click here. Actually, before I do that, let's just open the MongoDB compass, and you can see that right now we don't have any information right here, right? So let me try and click here on button 4. Why not? Cool. You can see that now this request was sent here, which was a 200 status code, so everything went fine. You can see the request URL here, and it was a post. The payload was just the button number 4, and the response we got back was actually the document from MongoDB. You can see, right? So all the information is basically here. And the reason why we're seeing that in the response is because we're returning here the success true and this click coming from up here, right? Okay, cool. So let's now try and open the MongoDB compass. And if we then go down here and let's try and refresh. So if I refresh here, so click on refresh database, we can now see that we have a new collection in the development database, which is called button clicks. And if I click on that one, we can see one document, which is this one. So the unique ID, the button number 4, and the date that it was clicked at. So let me try and go back to the front end here. So if I click here as well, and maybe also there, we should see 2 more documents in the database now, right? So let me try and refresh, and I can see those 2 new documents here as well. And by the way, the reason why it's inside the development database here is again just because in the .env here I added development. So if I change this to something else, so let's just try and change it to test here and refresh, and I have to restart the development server, because when you add something in the .env you have to restart the development server. So I just did that. Now let's go back and see what happens now when we click. So if I click again, you can see that it is then giving a success message again. Let me click 1 again, so click on that one as well. But now let's go here and see if I now refresh databases. You can see down here that we now also have a test with the button clicks. So we basically have 2 databases now. We have the development and the test. So that is how easily you can make a new database in MongoDB. You basically just change the end of the string here to whatever you would like to. And now I'm just going to change it back to development. Cool. So now we actually added something in the database. So now we know all about databases, and that's awesome. But we are still missing one big part, and that is how do we then show the right information to the right user? And for that we have to move down into what you usually call auth or authentication. So usually when you talk about sign up, sign in, sign out, all these kind of providers like logging in with Google or Facebook or GitHub or Magic Links, that is what you call authentication basically, right? So all of that is authentication. And what is protected and what is not protected. So if you just go to the front page of a normal website, usually it's not a protected area, but if you then go to the dashboard page, that's a protected area, because there you will have to first be logged in order to actually see what is there. And then once you signed up and logged in, then you usually will see something that is for you, right? Maybe you see your name, username, whatever, right? So that is what I mean with the protected area. And there are different ways you can set this up, because it's basically something you need for pretty much all applications. So many developers are working with this all the time, and there are many projects out there you can use, and we are going to be using one called Clerk auth for setting up authentication. And before we move on, let me just try quickly and explain how it actually works. And actually Clerk on their documentation page, they have some pretty good documentation and some good slides here. So let's just have a look at this one, right? So basically the way it works is that the user submits the username and password. The server then checks the credentials with the database. So in the database, we store the user's credentials, and then it creates a session including information such as user ID and session ID. And the server then sends back that session to the browser, and then it is stored in a cookie. And then the next time the user goes to a protected page on that specific website, then the request includes that cookie that has the session ID, and the server then checks in the database if the status of the session ID is still valid, you could say, or if it's expired. And if it's expired, you'll be sent back to the sign-in page, and then it basically responds back to the browser. And a cookie is just a small piece of data that is stored in the browser, so it's a small file basically. And if you go to any page that has a protected area and then click on F12, you can see most of them here, right? So if you go to session storage, you can see that there's a lot of data stored here, right? So if I delete all of these ones, so let me just try and do that. And if I also go here to cookies, and you can see that there's actually a lot here, delete. And if I go back here and refresh, now you can see that I have to log in again. That is because I deleted the cookie that was in the browser, right? So if I now log in with my information, so now I'm logged in again, and I can go to the dashboard page, as you can see here. And now if I click on F12 again and go here to session storage, you can see that there is all this information here again, right? So that is basically how it works. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up Clerk, right? So as a demo, you can see that I made now our front page in our demo environment. So the one that I call Come Join Me. I've set up the front page to just look like this, and this one is not protected, so everyone can enter this one. And if I then go to the user info one, so this one, user info one, that will then show the user's information, maybe the name, the email, or something like that, right? And this one we will then make a protected route, so a protected page. Okay, so let's go ahead and do it. So first of all, we will have to then go to Clerk and then go ahead and make an account and then go to the dashboard page. Cool. And then go up here and click on create a new application and then call it what you want to call it. So call it the name. Cool. And we will just be using email for sign in and sign up to begin with, and then later we can add these other kinds of providers, you call them. So create application, and now it basically tells us what we need to do, right? So here you can see that we have to install Clerk, and then we have to put these API keys in our .env, and then we have to add a middleware, and we also have to add this provider here in the layout. Okay, so let's just do it, and let's go down here to the terminal. Let's start with installing Clerk. So we install Clerk here, good, and then we copy paste these API keys and put them in the .env. So we just copy paste them in here like that. Then we add this middleware, and we are not using TS, so we're just gonna add it in a JS version, and then we just copy paste this one in here. Then you can see we basically just do all of this. So we do this one, we import this one, and then down here we have to then wrap it all in this Clerk provider like this. And let's also add this header here with the sign in button and the sign up button from Clerk that we see here down here in the Clerk provider. So it is right here. So let's add this one and add it in our layout that I already did. And remember that the middleware should actually be placed in the source folder here. So inside the src, add it here. And by the way, the middleware just lets you run code before it actually reaches the route. So you can do different stuff in here. For now, we're just gonna leave it with what Clerk provided us with. Okay, great. So for now, it will actually work if we then go and sign up. We should see the user in here, but we will not see it in our database though, because for that we will also have to set up what is called a webhook. And a webhook is basically just a listener that listens for something that is firing from Clerk after a sign up. So, but let's just try first and see if we see the user in here in Clerk if we go and sign up. So let's try and do it. So if I go here, I click on sign up here, and then I just add something here, right? So let me just add my email address here. I'm gonna add my Speedbuild Marketplace one. So like this. And actually I just realized that I don't want to use passwords here because we don't want to store passwords. So let's actually just go back to Clerk and let's go here to configure, and let's go down here, and instead of passwords we just want to use a email verification code here. So let's click save, and that is saved now, right? So then we go back here and let's just try and refresh, and now you can see that it's not asking for the password. password. So let's add the email again, click continue. And then if I open my email now, I'm getting a code that looks like this. So if I copy this code and paste that in here, and now I see the user here. So that worked. That's good. But we also want to have that user information in our database, of course. So for that, we will have to set up a webhook and use what is called ngrok. And all we're going to be using ngrok for is to basically create a temporarily public URL that then tunnels the request to our local server. Because remember, we are on a local server that is not public. So that's why we have to use ngrok for basically creating this public URL that then tunnels the request to our development server. So that is why we need ngrok, but we only need ngrok when we are in development environment. We don't need ngrok when we are in the production environment. So go ahead and sign up and then log in, and then it's going to tell you exactly how you install it. So you just choose the platform that you're on. So I'm on a Mac, but if you're on a Windows, you just choose the platform up here. So basically what you have to do is just copy paste this, then go back here and actually open another terminal. So you have two terminals running down here, right? So you can see that there are two terminals here now. And then just go and install ngrok first. Good, so it says that it was successfully upgraded. That's because I had already installed it before, but I was now upgraded to a newer version. So that's good. So then go back here and then just copy paste this one and paste it in here. Cool. So now it says here auth token saved. Then we go back here again and then we basically just copy this one. But instead of it saying 8080 here in the end, we go on 3000 because on the other terminal that I have here, I'm on 3000. So you have to add the same as you are doing in the other terminal here. So I'm going like this, and then you can see I got this forwarding public URL here. Great. And again, this public URL here just tunnels the request into our development server here. That's all it does. So now let's create the webhook and we place it in the API folder, of course, because it is an endpoint. Let's place it within a folder that is called webhooks. And then inside that one, let's call one that is called create user. And in here, we then place the route.js. Good, and I've then gone ahead and made a very simple model here with the user, so a user model. So you can see the schema up here is just the email and the type string, and it is a required field and it is unique, meaning that you cannot have two of the same emails in the database. Good, and now let's go back to Clerk and let's go here to configure, and then let's go down to webhooks because we are making a webhook at the moment, right? And then add endpoint. And then you can see down here what events you basically want it to fire for, right? So we want right now Clerk to fire when a user is created. So basically it is firing to this endpoint whenever a new user is created. And then this new endpoint, right? The only thing we know right now is the end of the URL there, right? So it's going to be /API/webhooks/create user. And how do I know that? That is because if you go back to our code here and see here, this one here, you can see that it is located within API, webhooks, and then create user. Good. And then for the beginning of the URL, as I was saying before, it's not going to work if we just add localhost 3000 because that's not a public URL. So we have to use ngrok for this. So if we then go back to here, and if we look down here in the ngrok terminal, you could say that we have here, we have this public URL here that is tunneling a request into localhost 3000. So basically what you do is that you copy this one and then you go back to Clerk and then you basically paste it in here. So now we have the public URL here and then the end here, and we can just write here create user, and then we can basically create that one. Now I get a signing secret here that we then have to save in our .env for it to work. So basically it will not work if we are not saving this one in our .env first, right? So I copy this one and then I go to my .env, paste that here, and in the beginning of it we call it this, but you could call it whatever you wanted to, but we're just gonna call it now webhook secret user created. Okay, good. And then of course we have to make the route.js for actually creating the user in our database. So basically it listens for that webhook and then it creates that user in our database. So this is a little bit complicated, but everything is set up in the boilerplate for you. So in the boilerplate you can just go ahead, everything is already there, and let me take you through it. So first of all, Clerk is using something called Swix to securely deliver webhook events. Okay, so let's try and go through it. So first of all, you can see it's a post, and then you can see here that we're first getting the webhook secret secret that we call it from the .env. Then if there's no webhook secret, we are then sending a status 500. Then if it's not a post, we are also sending a status 405. And here we're basically using Swix to verify the webhook's authenticity. And then here you can see that we are listening for the event. So if event type equals to user created, then do this, right? So first get the email from the body. And if there's no email, then console log this and return a 400. And then we basically connect to our database as we're doing just before. So with this function here, and we then first try and see if that user already exists. If exists, then we send a 400 back. So the email is already in use. But if it's not existing, then we create the new user and save it in the database. That is basically what the webhook does. Good, so let's go ahead and test it then. So let's first just actually open up our MongoDB. So if I open up MongoDB Atlas here and add the connection string here and save, then it should connect. And if I scroll down here, you can see that we are connected, and you can see that we don't have a user. We do actually have a user, sorry. So let me actually just delete that one because that was the one we made before. So I'm just gonna delete that one. So right now in the development database, we only have button clicks. And actually I can also just delete that one. Okay, so there is nothing in the development database right now. We don't even see the development database right now because there's nothing in it, but it will be created when we then create a user. So let's try and do it. So basically let's go ahead. One thing I just have to actually do here, because we added this webhook secret user here, I think I might have to actually restart the development server. So I'm just going to do that. And then here we still have ngrok working here. Cool. So let's do it. So if I go to the front page here, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and sign out there. Cool. And I'm also just going to go to Clerk here and go to users and delete this one here because we're going to create the same one. So delete. Okay, so there's nothing here either. Cool. So let's go to the front page. I just refresh. I click on sign up, and then I add my email address. I click continue. I then wait for the code to be sent to me. I then get the code here that I copy paste in here, and let's see what happens. We forgot to install Swix. Okay, so let's try and do that. So whoops, let's go here. So let's just go down here and do an npm I Swix. Cool. So now Swix is installed, and let's start the development server again. Cool. So let's try again. So I just go to Clerk again here, refresh here, delete this one, and we try again. So we go here, refresh, sign up, add the email address, click on continue. Then I get the code again. This is the code. So let me try and add that here, and let's see what happens. Cool. So now it looks like it was working. So let's see in the database. Well, let's first see in Clerk. So if I refresh here, I see the user here, and if I open the database and go here, click on refresh databases, I can now see the development one. I have a user collection inside, and I have a document inside the collection with the email address. Congratulations. Great, so just again, what we just did was that we were signing up on our web page, and then Clerk was firing a user created event after a sign up that we were listening for, and when we were then catching that event, we were basically creating a user in our database. So that's what just happened. Cool. And now let's go ahead and also do this in production, because so far we've only been doing this in development, right? So let's go ahead and do it. So first of all, click up here and then make a production environment as well. So click on create, and we then have to add our domain here. Great. Then you can see that it asks us to configure the domain. So let's just click there. And as you can see here, we then have to add these CNAMEs in our DNS. So let's do it. So let's go to one.com again. That's where I have mine, and go here to DNS settings, DNS records, and then CNAME. Cool. And then we basically add them one by one, right? So here we go. So this one, Clerk, and okay, good. And then you usually have to wait for like 5 to 10 minutes before they are verified. Good. And while we are waiting for all of them to be verified, we might as well add the environment variables to the production on Vercel, right? So remember, we created the webhook in Clerk. So let's just go to actually here in production. So let's go to configure, and then let's go down to webhooks. So here in production, then we have to add it again, right? So we choose the user created, and then up here, here we add the URL, right? And the URL now will be our domain and then the end as it was before. So what I can do is if I go here to production, I can copy this one. So if I click here on edit and then just go back to development, go back to production and then add an endpoint, user created. We can write here user created and then the endpoint here, and then the first part is then the domain, right? So comejoinme.com. So actually let's just go there and copy that one, and then this part will then be that, right? So here comejoinme.com. Okay, cool. And then the rest is the same as before. So I'm just gonna create that one. Oh, sorry, there was one small mistake there. Create that one, and then I have the signing secret here, which is different from the one we used in development, right? So that's the one we have to add in Vercel. So let's go to Vercel. And I go here to come join me, and I go on settings and I go to environment variables. Then let's just go to our code and remember what we called it. So we called it webhook secret user created. So as a key, I add that. And then the value is then the one from Clerk, right? So this signing secret here. So I copy that one and paste it here like this. Let me just be 100% sure. Yes. Okay. And I save it. But actually we're still missing one thing, and that is the API keys from here, right? So we also have different API keys here. So if you just click on copy here, so again, we're in the production here, right? So if I copy these ones, go back to Vercel, and then I can actually just paste here. So if I paste, you can see that it's pasting both of them in here. And then I basically also just save those. So remember, in development, these are the ones, right? So again, this is only for development. And now we have these two new ones here, this one and this one, that we're using in production. So there's a difference. Good. And now let's go back to Clerk and see if everything is good there. So if I go to domains and let's see what it says here. So it is saying that it is verified, and it is just waiting for the SSL certificate. So let's just give it one more second. And while we are waiting, let's just go ahead and push our changes. So I'm just gonna write changes here, changes to the front page and more. So commit, and I'm pushing to development first. So push, and then we make a pull request from development into the main. So let's do that and let's merge. Good. Great. So now you can see here on Clerk that all the new DNS CNAMEs were added correctly and verified. So let's now go to the page. So I go to comejoinmehere.com, and it of course looks similar to what it did on development. So now let's try and sign up and see if it works. So it should add the user both here in the production on Clerk, and then it should also add it here in a production database on our MongoDB. So let's see. So I go to sign up, and I just gonna add the same one, right? So I just add my email address and click on sign up. I then get a code that I just copy in here, and let's see what happens then. We are here, and let's see first in Clerk. So if I refresh here, you see the email here, the new user. And if I go to MongoDB and refresh here, you can see that we now also have a production database with a users collection and with one document, which is this new user. So now everything is set up. Now, one more thing I just want to show is it is relatively easy to add these providers, as you call them, in Clerk, right? So if you go here to SSO connections and then just, you can click down here, and then you basically just choose the provider you want to add, right? So there are so many built-in ones here, right? So Google, Facebook, whatever, right? And it depends a little bit on what provider you choose on how easy it is to add them, right? So for instance, for Facebook, if you want to add that one, you will also have to first make a Facebook page. And let's try and add it for Google, right? So if we add it here like this and click on add connection, then now if I go to my local environment here, so if I refresh here, well, I just have to actually start it here. And if I refresh here and if I sign out and now click on sign up, you can see now that I can also sign up with Google. Similarly, if I go here and add other ones, right? So if I also add Facebook, for instance, so if I add Facebook as well, then if I go back here and refresh, I can also see it is really easy to start using. But as I was saying just before, some of them does require a little bit of extra work to have them working in production as well, because you will, for instance, for Facebook, have to make a Facebook page first. But they do have pretty good guides here actually on how to do it. So if you click here on view docs for Facebook, then it takes you through here exactly how you have to do it in Facebook, right? So you have to make a Facebook developer account and so on, right? So yeah, that is how it works, and it is relatively easy to add these providers in Clerk, and that is why Clerk is super awesome to use. Now let's also quickly make the sign up and the sign in pages, right? So here in Clerk, you can go here to next steps. So I'm just in the Next.js quick start, and if I go down here, you can click here, and then you can see that we can build quickly a sign in and a sign up page, right? So you can see that it wants us to place it in a folder called sign in like this. So we go here to app, make a folder called sign in, and then we copy just this one like this and make that within the sign in folder, so like that. And then we make a page.js. So we click here and a page.js. Cool. And then we just copy this in here. Good. And actually then it says we should add this to the environment variables. So let's just add that down here like this. Cool. Then also let's also make the sign up. So similarly, we make a folder called sign up here in the app. So we go to app, new folder, sign up. Then we copy this one as well. Add that as a folder in the sign up like that. And then a page.js, right? Like that. Cool. And then we just copy that in here. And then in the env, let's add this here. So let's go to the env and like that. So cool. Now we have that here. Good. Now let's see if I go to our middleware now. I made some small changes here. So as you can see here, I'm protecting the user info page because that's a protected route, right? If you go to the protected route and you're not logged in, then you will basically be redirected to sign in the page that we just made. Let's see if that works. So if I go here, I just refresh, and actually let's just refresh here as well. So I just restart the development server because I just added something to the .env. So then you have to restart it in order for that to work. So I'm just gonna wait, and let's try and go to the user info page, and I'm not logged in right now. So let's go and let's see what happens. And I'm redirected to sign in. So it is working. Cool. Awesome. So let's try and sign in and see if it works, right? So if I sign in here, so like that, and let me see here. So then I get a code and I paste that in here. So now I am signed in, right? So if I now go here, I should be able to be redirected there. Cool. And it does. Good. So that is working. But we then still need to add some user information here for that specific user. And the only thing we basically have in the database right now is the email address. So let's show the email address. Okay, great. So now I remade the user info page here that we have here on user info. So as you can see here in the top, it's basically just showing in an h1 user information, and then down here you can see we have a function where we have 3 states, and then we have a useEffect that runs on component did mount, you say. So the first thing when this component is rendering, then it does this thing basically, and it is fetching from here this API endpoint get user info, and that is this route over here. And the only thing that this route is doing, you can see it's a get. It is connecting to the MongoDB database, and then it's basically just finding the email that is connected to the user and then returning the email. And if we go back here, you can then see that first of all we have a loader. So when this is happening up here, you can see that we have a loader running. So here you can see that we are turning off the loader. So to begin with, loading is set to true up here. So then once this is done, then it turns off the loader. And then you can see down here, we are basically just displaying the email if it has a length. So if email exists, then we're displaying it down here. Cool. Let's see what it looks like. So if I go here, we are on the front page. I'm just gonna refresh, and I am logged in right now. So I don't have to log in again, right? And then I basically just click here. I should then see my email address. Let's go. Boom. You can see that this is my email address we're displaying, and we are getting that from the MongoDB development area here. So this document, so we have the development database with a users collection, and then we have one document, which is this one, and we are then fetching this email and displaying it here on the front end. Great. So now we've basically done everything for setting up authentication. Great. So now that we know all about authentication, we will move on to how to send emails. And for that, there are different email providers out there. We're going to be using the one called Sendgrid, but there's also one called Resend that a lot of developers are using. And then there's also another one called Mailgun. They all work very similarly. So we're going to be using the one called Sendgrid. And for that, we will have to set up MX records. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then there's the notion about transactional and marketing emails. So transactional emails, that's usually after you buy something, then you get an automated email sent to you right after with all the details about what you just bought, maybe how to sign in and all this stuff, right? Whereas marketing emails, that's the ones that most people hate nowadays, but the ones where you make an email and then you send it out maybe to thousands or hundreds of thousands of emails all at once, right? And just a quick note on the magic links emails and the sign up emails, login emails that you usually get when you sign in and sign up and so on. All of that is already set up because we're using Clerk. So that's what we did in the last part, right? So a magic link is when you go and sign up or sign in, and then you get a link sent to your email that you click on. There's a button there that you click on, and then when you click on that one, then you are signed in. All of that is handled by Clerk. So that's the cool thing about using Clerk. So we are not going to be talking about that in this part. Here we're going to be talking about the transactional emails. So just so you know. And just to actually show you how that works in Clerk. So if you go to your account and then go to your project and then go here to configure, and if you then look here in this part here, you can see right now we're using email address up here. And if you then scroll down here, you can see right now we are using email verification code. But if I just wanted to use an email verification link, I would just do like this. And then when I click save, and now when I log in, so let's try and actually log in then. Okay, so here I'm on development and I'm just gonna try and log in here. So if I log in here, add my email address, and then it says here, check your email, right? So let's check our email. And as you can see here, I'm now receiving an email like this, where it says sign in to come join me. And then I just click on this one and then I'm signed in. So that is how easy it is in Clerk to choose different authentication strategies. So you have the normal password, you have email verification link, you have email verification code, where instead of the link here, you just get a code sent, and you also have SMS verification code. So that's how it works. Good, so now let's go to sendgrid.com, and if you haven't already, then create an account. You do that by just clicking up here where it says start for free, and you then just make a free account and then see on the other side. Good, and then once you are logged in, it should look somewhat like this. So you are here on the dashboard and there's probably no stats here for you. Then if you go down to settings and then click on sender authentication, and then you basically add a new domain here. So authenticate your domain. Then it says here which domain name server DNS host do you use. So if you just choose here one, in my example I'm gonna say one.com. No, you can't actually do that. So I'm just gonna go on other host listed, and then we click on next, and then we say here from domain, right? So authenticate domain. So our domain again is comejoinmehere.com, and then I click next. And then you can see that we have to then set up these records in our DNS. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's basically just, these three CNAMEs, and these are the keys and then the values, and then also this TXT. So let's go ahead and do that. So I go here to one.com, go to DNS, go to DNS records, and then I go to CNAME, and then I just copy them one by one. And then the TXT. Good, that's it. And now we click here that I've added these records, verify. I made a small mistake here, so you can also see that we're receiving some errors here. The thing is here, I added them like this, right? So you can see that it has the domain here twice, comejoinmehere.com, comejoinmehere.com. And that's because I was just copying from here, right? But here in one.com, when you add, you can see that it actually already has the domain here, right? So let's just go ahead and actually delete these ones first. So I'm just going to delete these ones. And we'll add them the correct way again. So basically I just have to add this part here, and then the key is correct. So like this. Okay, so we do it again. Good. And now let's see what it says if we verify. Okay, then it worked. Good. Now we return to sender authentication, and you can see that it is verified now. So that is awesome. Great. So let's go to one of my projects now so I can show you how it then works. Oh, but actually just before we do that, we also have to generate an API key. So what you do is that you go down here to settings and then click on API keys. And you can see I have 3 API keys here, but just create a new one and you just do full access. And and create a view. Oh, you have to call it something, so we call it probably the name of your new page or your new marketplace. So come join me here, I'll just call it that, and then I click on create and view. Cool. And then I get this one, and then I copy that one, go to my project here, and you go to the env, and then you call it something like maybe Sendgrid API key, and then you paste it in here like that. And remember never to share this one with anyone, right? Because with this one, other people can basically send emails from your domain, right? So you would never share this API key with anyone. You only have it here in the .env, and also you then also have to go to Vercel later when you push to production and also put that same API key in production. So on Vercel in the environment variable area. So in here where you would just copy that one and add that here as the key, and then the value here as well, that one. And just to show you how it works, so I'm just going to show it from one of my projects, which is Speedbuild Marketplace, the boilerplate for making a marketplace quickly. So after a purchase here, of course, I want to then send the user that just purchased information about how to then get access to the GitHub repository. So I of course have to send that right after the payment. And the way that it works is that we'll actually come back to very soon in the next chapter, you could say, is that we set up a webhook and Stripe then fires an event so that I know that someone just purchased, and then we basically capture that event via our webhook, and then we also send an email with all the information for that new paying user, right? So let's go into the project and see how that actually works. So yeah, so I'm in the webhook here, right? And as you can then see here, I then have a event type that I'm listening for, and that is the checkout session completed. Actually, we'll get back to this soon, but what I just wanted to show you right now is that somewhere here I'm then sending an email as well. Yeah, here it is, right? So I'm sending this welcome email down here where I am sending to this function that I'm importing from here, from libs sendemail.js, that I am then sending to that function the customer email, the customer name, and the new user ID, and then I'm sending that email. Cool. And the email is very simple, right? So it's basically just, first of all, you have to install this library from Sendgrid, so this one, Sendgrid/mail, and then you have to then get your API key, the one I just saved before in the .env. So we are getting that one from the .env, and then we're just basically just sending an email like this, right? So basically to the email, so the email that we just got from Stripe, then from, it's always from me, so that's my email, and then my name. And then I have a subject line here, welcome to Speedbuild Marketplace, and then we have the text and the HTML here, where it's basically just explaining what you just bought and how you get access to the repositories on GitHub. So that's how simple it is to send emails basically. So then you can just, like send emails like this. So it's super simple to set up these emails and using Sendgrid for sending them. So that is basically how easy it is to send emails with Sendgrid. And by the way, if you search for Sendgrid email sending example, you will get to the documentation pages. And by the way, Sendgrid is owned by Twilio, so that's why I'm here. And then you can see here they have pretty good documentation here on how to do it. And this is basically what we just did, right? So there's plenty of documentation you can use for how to set this up, but it is very easy to send these transactional emails. Great. So now that we know all about emails, then it is time to then move on to a very important topic, which is Stripe, so you can actually earn money on your marketplace. And we're only going to be looking at Stripe in this course. There are other ones out there you can use, but if you are very small and just starting out, I would still recommend using Stripe Connect for your marketplace. But there's also like MongoPay and Adyen that you can use in some examples, but not if you're just starting out. If you're just starting out, it's basically easiest to use Stripe Connect. There are some parts of the world where you can't use Stripe Connect. There might be some local providers you can use instead that you'll then have to check out. Cool, but we'll start with just looking at Stripe and figuring out how Stripe works. And we'll try and also check out the webhooks you have to set up for basically listening for Stripe events that are fired after a purchase. And then we'll move on to Stripe Connect and also the Stripe Connect onboarding that has to be set up when you use Stripe Connect. So let's do it. And for using Stripe, you will have to have a company somewhere in the world set up. That you will have to do first. And then when you make your Stripe account, you will also be asked for a lot of personal identification documents that you'll have to submit to Stripe along with all the company details. So go ahead and do that. And by the way, I believe that if you are based in India and if you have a company in India, you cannot use Stripe, I believe. So then there are other payment providers you can use. There's one called Lemon Squeezy that I've heard works in India, so then you can use that one instead. I'll not go through that one. I will only go through Stripe in this course. And by the way I do it with Stripe is that I have one main account, and then every time I make a new project, I add a new sub account, you could say, on Stripe, so that you have a main account and then all your sub accounts inside that main account, and it's all under the same company. And just remember that Stripe is a huge company. It's $1 billion company. It's globally, it's worldwide. So there are many different ways you can use Stripe, and their documentation is actually pretty good, but it's also huge, right? So I'm just gonna go ahead and show you one or two examples of how I use Stripe, and then we'll move to Stripe Connect. Okay, so let me just first show you how I use Stripe on You Are My Star, which is a marketplace for buying and selling stars basically. So if I go to the dashboard area here, and then I go down to user info, you can see that I can change my avatar here, and I can then change it to different free ones like this beautiful guy here, or I can also go to the premium ones which cost something, right? So if I want to change to this beautiful snake here, you can see that I can either use Stardust, but I need to have 1,000 Stardust in order to actually pay with Stardust, and I don't have that right now. And Stardust is the, you could say, the local currency on the marketplace. But I can also pay with a card, and that costs then $8. And when I click here, I will then be redirected to Stripe, and just notice that I'm in local environment right now. Okay, cool. So I click and it takes me here, and the reason why the image, by the way, is not showing here is just because I'm in local environment and it only has access to the image if I'm in production. I can show you afterwards how it looks like in production. So, but anyways, so then you can see here, I'm trying to buy this beautiful image here, and I can then add my information here. Cool. But the thing is, in order to get this to work, so I can pay now, but first we will have to then have the webhook listening for this event that Stripe will fire after a payment. And remember how we did it with ngrok and setting up this public URL that then tunnels the request down to the local server? You can do it similarly in Stripe. So you don't have to actually use ngrok in Stripe. You can go here to the developer area and then go to webhooks, and you can see that I already have some set up here actually. So let me just try and go here for click on local listener, and you can then see here that I can start a test environment, right? So let's go ahead and do this, right? So if I start by doing this, I then go to my project and start a new terminal, and I start Stripe login. Okay, so then I have to click enter, and you can see that it's then authorizing me here via Stripe, right? So this is cool, right? So this is basically the same as using ngrok. So I just allow access. So now we basically have this tunnel set up, you could say. Cool. Then I close that one and I go back to my code, and then you can see here I then have to set up this forward to basically set up the correct tunnel, right? So if I then go here, set up this one, and we are on 3000, and the webhook, where is that one located? So the webhook is located down here under webhooks and then Stripe avatar. So let's add that, right? So it will be API, webhooks, and then Stripe avatar like this, right? And then we click enter. Cool. So now it is listening, and you can see that we get this key here, and let me just get that key and go back here, and we want to trigger an event here. So you can see that we can then select what event to trigger on, right? And for that we have to then look at our code, of course, right? So if I go here, what event did I set it up for? So you can see that I have this one, payment intent succeeded. So let's choose that one, right? So payment intent succeeded. So we choose that one here, and it's already chosen, right? Cool. Awesome. And remember that webhook secret here, so that webhook secret that we got here, this one, we have to then add in our .env, right? So that one here I've added in the .env. Cool. So basically the way it works now is that if I then pay for something now on Stripe here in development, then this listener should basically receive that event that Stripe is firing and then do what it's supposed to be doing, which is updating the database, right? So you can see here that if this is catched, you could say, then it's basically connecting to the database, and then it's finding the user using the Clerk user ID, and then it's updating the avatar down here. You can see here, down here. Okay, so let's try and do it. So I add my email here, and then I just add a fake card. In Stripe, you can just add 42, 42, 42, and then it is a fake card. And then if I just add some stuff here, like Peter, doesn't matter what I add here, and I pay, let's see what happens here. So you can see that it now it directs me back here, and you can actually see that there was some kind of mistake here. So we got a 308, and that is actually because we should have added the, you can see that here we, on this marketplace, we're using a dash in the end of all URLs, so we have to add that also here. So let me just go back here, and if I do forward here and then add that one like that and then enter, and now we try again actually. So if I go here, choose the mouse, pay with card, I add an email, and then I do 42, 42, 42, 42, and just add something here. It has to be something in the future. Add Peter here and just pay. Let's see what happens now if I get a correct message now. Cool. So now you can see that it changed to that mouse now, and I'm getting a 200 here. So now it works. Cool. So that is how it works with webhooks in Stripe. Good. And just, if I go to production, so you'remystar.com, and if I go to the dashboard here and then go down to the user info area down here, and if I want to change it here, you can see, of course, it looks similarly. And if I choose here and do not pay with Stardust, I pay with card. And if I go then to Stripe, you can see that image is there now. So just and also if I then go back here, so let me just go back. I'm still in production here, as you can see. And if I go to Stripe and close this one, you can see that in production, you just add your webhook endpoints up here. So this one is the one that is for the Stripe avatar. So if I click on that one, you can see that it works similar to as our example in Clerk. So you basically just add the URL here, which is the URL to your folder here. So down here, Stripe avatar, and then you add the signing key, so the signing secret that you click here to see, that one you add in your .env, and you also add then on Vercel where you're hosting your API. So that is how it works here. Good. So let me also just take you through the code for what we just did. So I'm here on the user info, which is called profile page up here in the URL, you can see, and I then click here on change avatar to change my avatar. So let's go in the code. So here I'm on the profile client side, and you can see that I have this handle avatar selection, right? And you can see I have a handle payment down here as well. So basically, if you click on a avatar that requires payment, then it takes you here to this API claim premium avatar. So this route here, and that is this route here. And here you can see that you have different methods for paying, right? So if the user paying with Stardust, then this is happening. So it's basically just subtracting the 1,000 Stardust points or whatever you call them that it costs from the user's profile. But down here, so if the user chose to pay with Stripe, then you have this one down here, right? And this is where we are creating the Stripe checkout session. So here you can see, so payment method is card, and you can see here all the pricing data information that you can add here, right? So the currency, product data, the images, and the amount here, which is 800, which is $8, right? So we could just change to whatever price here we would want to, right? And here I'm also adding the success URL and the cancel URL. So the success URL is where the user is taken after a successful payment, and the cancel URL is if you just cancel the payment, right? Cool. And then we also have some metadata here, and that is basically it, right? Cool. But for the webhook, the one we just went through before, right? So the webhook is then the one who actually makes the change in the database after a successful payment. So again, right? So here I'm in the webhook, and you know a little bit how webhooks looks because it's kind of similar to the one for Clerk. And here you can see we're basically listening for this event here. So payment intent succeeded. And if we then receive that one, we are basically connecting to the database, and then we are first finding the user using the Clerk user ID, and we are then finding the avatar that the user has chosen, and we change the image to the new avatar and save that in the database. So that is all we basically do. Okay, and just another way of looking at it so that we understand 100% what is actually happening here, right? So the client goes and pays for something. Then we're using Stripe to actually process that request, and after a successful payment, a webhook event is then sent. So our API is then listening for those events, and if it receives the correct event, then it basically updates our database. It maybe gives access so that the user can now access the tool that was just bought, and sometimes we also then send an email for saying to the client, the user that just paid, hey, you just paid, paid, everything went fine. Here is how you can access what you just bought. And the way that you open the Stripe window, you could say, is that here on the route, right, when you are creating this new session here, Stripe checkout session, you're creating that one with all the information you want to show, and then you're basically opening up, you're sending back this URL that you get from Stripe with the session URL, and then here you're basically opening up that window so that the user is directed to the Stripe payment page. Just like in this example here, if I click here and then pay with card, you can see that it's opening up this new checkout URL here. And remember that there are many other webhooks you can set up and listen for, right? So for instance, if you have a monthly subscription running, right, and your product is something that users pay for monthly, then you should probably also set up the event and listen for the event that is called customer subscription deleted, right? So if the customer has ended their subscription, then you should listen for that event, because Stripe will then fire that event. And if you then have your API endpoint set up so that it listens for that event and then updates the user document probably, right? So you would update the user's document so that they do not have access anymore, right? So it could be maybe a boolean has access true, and then you would set that to false, for instance. And another event that is interesting to listen for is the checkout session expired, and that is because if a user has created a checkout session on Stripe and they might have added their email there but didn't click on the actual purchase button, so they didn't go all the way and made a purchase, but they added their email, then Stripe can send the email to you, and you can then listen for that email, and then you can send them a marketing email with something about, like, you almost finished your purchase, go ahead, here's a 10% discount code, or whatever you want to do, right? So you can basically try and incentivize them to actually go ahead and finish that purchase. So that is also a cool event to listen for. And besides that, like, Stripe has so many different events here, right? So like hundreds, I think, right? So there is a bunch here, but I think the ones that I just mentioned now are the most important ones. Good, and now let's move to Stripe Connect. So on a marketplace, you're going to be using Stripe Connect for most of your payments because you want the buyers to be able to buy directly from the sellers, and you as the marketplace owner, you are kind of just the middleman. So, and for setting that up, you'll have to use Stripe Connect. So let's try and go through it. And inside Stripe, the way you add Stripe Connect is that you basically just go to your account and then you go down here to products, and then there will be like a button saying if you want to activate Stripe Connect, and then you basically just enable it, and then you can start using Stripe Connect. And the way it works as a marketplace owner is that in order for a seller who wants to sell something on your marketplace, you will first have to kind of onboard them on Stripe before they can start using Stripe for selling their products, so that a buyer can then buy directly using Stripe Connect from the seller. So first you have to onboard the seller. So usually the flow is that you first get a seller to sign up, and then they are maybe directed here to the dashboard page. Then you want to basically get them to onboard on Stripe Connect. So you can do it either before they can create a listing, or you can also get them to create a listing, and then before they publish their listing, you tell them, hey, in order to publish your listing, you first have to onboard on Stripe Connect. Or the third option is that you can also just, as I actually do here on Nordic Mocks, you can also just let them still list their products, but if they haven't onboarded on Stripe Connect, you will then just show a button saying that you can only write the buyer maybe. So you cannot buy, but you can write the buyer, and then they can handle their payments some other way. So there are different ways you can do it. But if you only want to have onboarded sellers so that all buyers can basically buy directly from your sellers, then you have to onboard all your sellers. Cool. So let me show you here in MongoDB as I'm doing it here on NordiMonk. So you can see I have a user object here and I'm in development, right? And then you can see here I have a boolean down here saying that is Stripe connected true. So this seller here is actually onboarded. But if I change this now to false and I save that, update it, and then I refresh here, you can see now that there's this button down here that tells the seller that they have to onboard and connect their account. So if I click on this one, it basically first asks me what country I'm from. So let me put in Denmark, and then I click on connect, and then it basically redirects me to Stripe, so to the onboarding flow. And here I then have to add all my details as a seller. So that is basically how it works. And again, I'm in localhost, that's why it says this use test phone number, but it will ask me a lot of different things here, right? So if I just click here, it will then take me further, and you can see that I have to add different information here depending on where I'm from and stuff like that. So I can just add something now. So let me just add something. And you can see that it also asks me for an IBAN number. So if I add that here, and it also asks me for if I have a business and stuff like that, right? So, but basically in the very end, you have to then click on agree and submit. And then I'm basically sent back to NaughtyMox. Cool. And now I have a webhook, of course, that is listening for that event that Stripe Connect then fires, so that it tells me that this seller is now onboarded. So now I know that this seller can actually go ahead and sell stuff to buyers. And of course then my database is updated. So if I click here, so right now it says false here. If I refresh, it now says true. So that is basically how the onboarding works. Oh, and I just want to show you how it is on production here, right? So if you go here to naughtymox.com, you can see this is my marketplace for buying and selling these kind of moving mugs. And if I go into this listing here, for instance, I can see that this is the seller, and I can also see here actually that she is Stripe Connect onboarded, because I can click on the buy now button. So that's the way I have made it. So I can click here, and then I can add my address and proceed to checkout. And let me try and do it actually. So if I add something, right, Gamel, like this, and I choose the country Denmark, and I proceed, and I enter my name. Let me just add Rasmus, and I then choose the shipping here, and I click to proceed. You can see that I'm then taken to the Stripe checkout. So cool. And then I can pay here, and then if everything goes through, she will then receive her money on her Stripe account. So, but let me go back, because what I actually also wanted to show you is that not all sellers on the NaughtyMox marketplace are Stripe Connect verified, right? So here, so this seller here, Vili from Finland, you can see that I can now not click on the buy now button, but I can still write her if I wanted to. So because I realized that many users, they prefer actually just to write each other and not necessarily buy via Stripe on this marketplace, I also made this possible. So you can also just write, and then they can communicate, and then maybe arrange some other way of paying for a product here, right? So that is why I made it this way. And you can also make an offer, by the way, if you want to negotiate the price. But there are different ways you can basically do this, right? So you can either always make it mandatory to onboard a seller, or you can do like I've done here, where it's not mandatory to onboard a seller. A seller can still make a listing even though they're not onboarded, and then you basically have these kind of options where you can then write and communicate with the seller, and then the seller and the buyer then have to figure out themselves how to handle the payments. Okay, and the way it works in the code when onboarding a new seller to Stripe Connect is that I have here in the dashboard page a function where I'm basically making a request to my endpoint, and on my endpoint here, which is this one, I'm then similar to as we were doing before, I then have this one where it's like I'm creating a Stripe account with all these information, and with the information that I have from the database already, the first name, the last name, the email, and the country. And then I'm basically getting this account link for onboarding that I then send the user to here. And when a buyer then buys from a seller, it works in a similar way as I was showing before, but with some small adjustments. But it's similar that you create a checkout session, so a Stripe checkout session, so the buyer is sent to Stripe. But what you also include in the checkout session is the platform fee. So how much you want to take off as a cut of the transaction, right? So in this case, you can see that it is 5%, but you can basically take whatever percentage you would like to, or you can also take a fixed fee, right? So if it's, for instance, like the price is $100, you would take $5, or you could take whatever you wanted to, right? And it's very different from marketplace to marketplace what the fee, the marketplace fee you would charge is. But as you can see down here, I'm also displaying the platform fee, and then I'm returning that session URL so that it is opened for the user. And just to show you what it looks like on the front end, right? So the fee you want to take per transaction, right? I'm showing it as a processing fee, but you could call it whatever you want, right? On the front end. But it's basically the fee that you earn as the marketplace owner, right? So if I go to a checkout here, you can see that I'm calling it processing fee, but you could also call it marketplace fee or whatever you want to call it, right? But that is basically how it works, right? So that's what you are earning as the marketplace owner, right? And here I am charging 5%, but you could charge whatever percentage you would like to. And just one more thing. So all sellers on marketplaces that are using Stripe Connect for payments will have access to an express Stripe dashboard that looks somewhat like this, where they can log in with their details and then they can basically see their transactions, how much money they earned, and they can also withdraw money here from their Stripe Express account to their normal bank accounts. So that is basically how it works, right? So they will be able to see everything in here and then pay out money from here as well to their bank accounts. Good, so now we know all about Stripe Connect, how to charge money on our marketplace, how to onboard sellers on our marketplace. So let's just move on to a few points on security. So there's some areas that you should be aware of, so let's jump into it. Let's start with server and client components. Good, so I'm on You're My Star, my marketplace for buying and selling stars, and I'm in local environment, as you can see up here. And let me just go to dashboard, and if I then go down to Stardust here, you can see we're on Stardust page up here, and you can see that it's showing us we have currently 200 Stardust points, or whatever you call it, and that is coming here from the database. You can see the user document here, and I have Stardust 200 here. Okay, so let's jump into the code. So where is this actually happening? So I'm here on the app folder, and then I have a Stardust folder, you can see, with a page.tsx and a Stardust client page. So this is TypeScript, but it's very similar to JavaScript, so you're going to be understanding it. Anyway, so if I go here to the page.tsx first of all, you can see that it's a server component because there's no use client up here. Again, if you remember, if I add use client like this, then it is a client component. So then the rendering happens on the client, whereas if I do like this, then the rendering happens on the server. And when you are fetching data in general, it's always best to try and do it on the server whenever you can. You should pretty much try and do everything on the server and as little fetching as possible on the client. Cool. So all I'm doing here is that I'm basically just fetching from this route here, the user route, which is this one up here. And this one is just returning the user document, which is this one again. And then if I go back here, you can see that I'm only just returning the data.stardust, and that is just the Stardust number here, the 200, right? Cool. And then I'm basically just passing that down to the Stardust client, which is the client component. So this one. And if I add a console log here, let's try and add a console log like this, then you can see that it's console logging down here in the terminal because it's on the server 200, which is the Stardust number, right? So that is all we are passing down to the client. And then on the client here, as you can see, first of all, it's a client component because we have used client here. And then all it does is basically just to show the Stardust down here. So that is all this component is basically doing on the client. It's just showing it. So you always want to do as much fetching as you can on the server because you don't want to expose any sensitive data on the client. Great. And then regarding API endpoint controls, you always want to have some security added in the top of your endpoints so that only the ones who need to access your endpoints can access basically. So let me show you what I mean by that. So in this example here, for instance, so this auth here is basically a function that returns a promise that then resolves into an object with all the information about that user. That is how it works. And you can then see that here, if no user ID, then we basically return a 401 so that you are not authorized to actually access this endpoint. And similarly down here, we're then connecting to the database and then we're trying to find a user. But if we do not find a user, then we also say user not found and then return a 404. So that's what I mean with basically protecting all your endpoints. You should do that for all your endpoints, something similar to this, so that you only allow people that should have access to access basically. And now for the environment variables, you always just want to have them in the .env, or of course in Vercel, you want to have them on the settings area here, and then down here in the environment variables, nowhere else basically, right? And also when you push to production, you don't want to push them, right? So you have to add this .env here, so basically this one, in the gitignore, right? And every time you then use the environment variables, right, you want to do it as we explained before. So for instance, for the connect Mongo here we're just using process.env to get that string from the .env, we never want to hard code it here because then we might expose it, right? And if someone gets access to your string, for instance, your MongoDB string, then they will have access to a database basically. So you never want to do that. You always just want to have them here in the .env and then access them using the process.env and never push them to GitHub. And then regarding the middleware, again, that runs before it reaches the route, right? So you can do a lot of cool stuff here, right? So for instance, what we did earlier, so we are creating protected routes, and if you try and enter a protected route but you're not logged in, then you're basically redirected to the sign-in. So that's one thing you can do here, for instance. But what you could also do is to prevent access based on roles, for instance. So let's say you had an admin role, and then for certain pages you would have to be an admin to actually access those. You could also, for instance, limit the number of requests from a certain IP address. So if you suddenly see that one IP address is sending like lots and lots and lots of requests, you could basically either block it or you could limit it so that it could only make, I don't know, like 5 requests per day or per hour or something like that. So there are many cool things you can do here in the middleware. And what you can also do is here in Vercel, they have this firewall area where you can enable attack challenge mode, which basically blocks certain bots. So they have a directory of bots, and then some will basically be blocked from accessing your page. And they also have other things you can do here, right? So bot protection, manage rule set, and here you can also do IP blocking, you can see, right? So you can go just here and then block a certain IP. So that's relatively easy to do it this way as well. And then of course you should also just go and use AI as much as possible. So whenever you made a new route, for instance, then just ask the AI here, is this route protected or are there any security issues? And then it will basically go through the route and then tell you if there are any areas that it believes that you should improve. So that's a great thing to always do for all your routes basically. And here you can see that it is basically saying that it is looking at the code and this route is indeed protected. And then it basically breaks the whole thing down. So this is super awesome. So you should always do that, of course. Awesome. And now let's move to the advanced area, the advanced stuff area that I call it. And these are things that are not necessarily that necessary to have deep knowledge about, but it's still gonna help you. So let's start with a little bit more on Next.js, and let's start with SEO. Okay, so SEO is quite a broad topic, right? So here we're just gonna be focusing on how to actually add the metadata object, as you call it, in Next.js. And the metadata object is basically some additional data that you can't see from a user's perspective, but it's added in the head of the HTML. So let me just show you what I mean. So this page here on You're My Star, and then how it works. This one, if I click up here on this plugin that I have in Chrome that is called SEO Meta in one click, it's free, so go ahead and install it. You can see that it shows me the title, the description, and the URL, if there's any canonical, and so on, right? It also shows me what it looks like on socials. So like here, open graph information that Facebook is showing. So this is the image, and also down here for Twitter. So basically, if I share it, for instance, on WhatsApp, on Twitter, this image will then show. And in order to make that happen, you have to add what is called open graph information. Okay, and by the way, if I click the F12 and then go to the elements here and open the head here, you can see all this information here, right? So the title, description here, and so on, right? So everything that plugin was just showing, it is basically just getting that from the HTML head. Okay, so how do we add this information in Next.js? So let me go to the code. So in Next.js, there's what we call a metadata object that we can basically add all the information inside it. And that one only works on a server component. So usually what you do is that if you have a new folder called How It Works inside the app folder, so that is this page here, then you have the server component, which is the page.tsx or the page.js. And then in the top here, you import metadata from Next, and then you basically just add all the metadata information inside this object. Cool. And here you can see I have the title, the description, and all this stuff, right? And that is basically it. So once you do that, Next.js will then automatically add it in the head of the HTML when it is rendered. So that is really, really cool. Great. And then of course, sometimes you're in the situation where you have a listings page, for instance, like this one that shows all listings on the You're My Star marketplace. And then, you have different listings, right? And if I click here, you can see it says listings and then the ID of that listing. And then if I go to this one, the ID is different. So that's a dynamic route, you call it, right? And this ID here is just the ID from the database, this one up here, right? So it's basically just this ID that is then put in the URL up here, right? Cool. So, but how do you then do SEO for these ones, right? Because as you can see here, if I click here, it does actually add the name of the star here in the description, right? So this one is called whatever. This can't even say this name actually, but if I click here, it does say that right here, right? So how do you do that? Let me show you. So if I go back here into the code, I'm now on this dynamic route on the page.js. So again, this is a server component. So here we then have access to this generate metadata, which is used for dynamically getting the metadata for a dynamic route. So what you want to do here is that you of course want to then access the database to actually get some data for that specific listing you are looking at, right? So we have this function here, get listing metadata, that I have up here, that is basically just accessing the database and then getting the information for that specific listing. So if I again show you here in the database, let's say we were getting this information for this listing, it would basically just return to me this information here where we have the description, the name, all the information here, right? And then we basically just again use that information that we get here down here. So here we then have the description, the title, and open graph information, and so on, right? So if we for instance look at the description here, you can see that it says a beautiful hand-drawn star name and then the name that we just got from the database, right? So that is basically how you do it for a dynamic route. It's also very easy. And again, if you then look here, you can see that the description includes the name of the star. So that is how you do it for dynamic routes. Great, and we already just talked a little bit about it, but a dynamic route is then something like this, right? So if you're here on You Are My Star, then you can see we are on listings, and then there's this weird number up here, which is the listing ID. And if I go back here and click on another listing, then this is another ID. So that's a dynamic route basically. And in the code base, it basically looks like this, right? So you can see we're in the app folder, then we have listings, and then you have the listing ID inside these square brackets here, right? And just so you understand it, so if you want to make a dynamic route, you have to make it like this in Next.js. So you have to put it inside these square brackets basically, like I'm doing here with the listing ID. And the way you do it basically is that you can basically access the dynamic parameter through a params props that Next.js they provide you with. So here you can see I'm defining it here as listing ID, and it's a string because this is TypeScript. And if I then go down here, you can then see that I'm then using it down here to then get the listing data for that specific listing. And then I'm basically just passing the information down to the client one, which is this one. So this is the client component then. Great. And now just a short one on skeleton, right? So a skeleton is basically the same as a loader, some people call it. So it's basically what is shown before the page is fully rendered. So when I click on a page, until it is fully rendered, no matter if it's a client component or a server component, then it's cool if it shows something like a skeleton before it is fully rendered. So let me show you what it looks like. So if I click here, you see this skeleton, and then you see the information here, right? So if I go back and click on this one, check it. And if I click here, it looks pretty cool, right? So that's called a skeleton because it basically looks similar to what is going to be here when it's fully rendered, if you know what I mean. So, and in the code, if I go here and you can see that I'm in my dynamic route here, and I then go to the loading.tsx. So if you place a loading.tsx or a loading.js inside a folder, then Next.js will automatically show that when you render a page. So that's all you basically have to do. So if I go here, for instance, and if I just remove all this, and if I add it like this, so I add an H1 and then I just add some CSS here. So it has a 4XL text size, bold, the text is centered, there's 10 margin to the top, and the text is red 500. So now it will basically just show that instead. So as you can see here, it is showing that one now. And if I go back to how it was before, you can see that now it is showing the skeleton again. And again, the reason why I call it a skeleton, it is actually kind of the same as the loading, but a skeleton just kind of represents what is going to be there when it's fully rendered. So it kind of shows the background of the elements that are about to be shown. So, and most people find that really cool, and I also find that really nice looking. So that's why it's called a skeleton, and that's how you add it. So you basically add it inside a loading.js or a loading.tsx. That's how it works. Awesome, guys. Now you are almost an AI marketplace developer, but now I just want to take you through a couple of AI points that you should know about to basically build 100 times faster. Okay, let's start with kind of the setup area. So first of all, there are 3 editors right now that are all pretty good. I'm using the one called Cursor, which is this one, but Visual Studio Code is also quite okay. They have GitHub Copilot that I used to use, but now I prefer Cursor. And there's also a third one called Windsurf that is also quite good actually. It's pretty much the same as Cursor, so you could also go ahead and use that one. But the one that I'm using at the moment is Cursor, and just remember that this might change later on this year or next year, right? Because maybe there's gonna be a code editor that is even better than Cursor in half a year or a year. You never know. The development within this area is very fast, so just follow along and then you will be fine. But for now, I'm using the one called Cursor, so that is the one we are going to be talking about right now. And you can download this one both on Mac and on Windows. And to become a good AI marketplace developer, there are some shortcuts and nice to knows you should know about. So let me just go into these ones that I believe make you a much better AI marketplace developer. Let's do it. So if we go into the code here. So first of all, if you go to up here, and if you go here to Cursor, then go down to settings and then click on just Cursor settings. Then you're in the settings area for Cursor. And if you then go down to models, you can see what models here you can enable. And you know, new ones are coming all the time, right? So when you look here, it might look different for you. And this will change in 6 months, a year, and so on, right? But right now, the one that I'm using the most is Claude 3.5 or 3.7, and sometimes I'm also using GPT-4, but you know, you can also enable Grok, there's DeepSeek, Gemini, and so on, right? Cool. Then a couple of shortcuts. So first of all, if you just want to make a very small change, for instance here, this H2 here, as you can see, so let me show you the page. So that is this one up here, local storage web API, right? So let's say I just want to change this to red color instead, right? So instead of using the chat area, which is this one up here, so you can click here to open it, or you can also do Command I and then it opens up the chat there, right? But if it's just a very small thing, then you can also just mark it like this and then do Command K, so it opens up this small chat window right here, and then you can just say change to red color, and then it will basically just make that change right there, right? So you can see in red here, that is the old one, and the new one, it just changed the text red 700 instead of text gray 700. So that's TailwindCSS, right? And all you just have to do is click accept, and then you can see that it is now red color here, right? Good. So I usually use the Command K, so the inline editing for CSS, for instance. So if it's just something very small, then you use Command K. Now for the actual chat area, so Command I, this is where I make, you know, for instance, examples of components and so on, right? So usually what I do is that I never code anything from the beginning anymore. I always get a first draft here. So I ask it to make a new page, and then I get a first draft, and then I basically make some small changes myself sometimes, but I never write all the code anymore, right? So I would say that I'm letting AI make 80 to 90% of my code now, and then probably 10 to 20% I'm writing myself, but only on top of what AI provides me with first, because doing anything else will just take you way longer time, so that is not efficient anymore. Then you can see here that you can click on this one, and then there's this agent here, and there's also ask. So the agent, that's what you use for when you're coding. So if you wanted to code something, then you basically ask it there, right? And then there's this ask that is used for just asking general questions. That could be, for instance, if you are unsure about what is GitHub, then you can ask that here. So it will not change anything in the code. It will not access the code. It will not take the code in as context for your question. It will just answer your question basically. So what is GitHub, and then it will basically answer that. And here you can see it is answering what GitHub is. Okay, cool. So if we then go back to the agent, you can see here that I can choose the model it should be using, but you can also set it to auto, and then it is Cursor that is choosing the model for you. I usually do manually, and at the moment I'm using Claude 3.5 the most, sometimes 3.7 as well, but again, this will probably change in a couple of months, in 6 months, because new models are coming out all the time. You can also enable the max mode, but that one will cost money. Now then, when I'm coding here, right? So if I open a new one here, so you just click up here and then you can open a new chat, you want to give it the context for what you want to do and not that much else. And the way you give it the right context is you can either drag it up like this, for instance. So if I wanted to know about the global CSS, I can drag it up like this, but I can also just write at and then give it the context like this. So if I, for instance, want to give it this route here, get user info, I would just write here get user info, and then it basically has that as context. Similarly, if I wanted to give it this page here called hello, this route here that is called hello, I can also just write hello, and then you can see I can just select that one, and then it also has that as context. And what you can also do is if you, for instance, just wanted to have access to this part here, you can copy it and then just paste it up here, and then you can see that it's referring those exact lines like that. Good. So that is also a very handy way of doing it. Now let's say that you want to make a new component that needs to look in a certain way. If you then have access to something that looks somewhat similar, then it's often actually very smart to give it that context. So let's say you wanted to make a new header, for instance, and you want it to look somewhat similar to this one, this Tailwind one, then you basically just copy this code. So give it all this context here. So just copy that in, go to the code editor, copy that in, and then write something like, can you make a header somewhat like this, but without the logo or something like that. And then you just copy the whole thing in and then ask it to do that, and then it will do that. And by the way, it's often best that you decide the names of all your folders for your pages and your routes, right? So always go for a naming that is easy to understand, both for you, but also for the AI. So for instance, call all your buttons dash red or something like that, button dash header or something like that, right? So that you know exactly what it is for, and all of them are called buttons, because then it will be easy for the AI to understand, okay, this is a button, this is a header, this is a hero, and so on, right? So always use a consistent and easy to understand naming structure. And another super interesting and very useful feature that Cursor has is that it can generate code from image, right? So you can just give it an image of something, and then it will basically generate the code for that. So if you, for instance, wanted to create a calendar, which can be a little bit complicated sometimes, then you could, for instance, take an image of this one. So you just take an image like this, and then you can basically just paste the image in here and write something like create a component that looks similar to this one, call the component calendar component, and place it in the components folder. And now you can see that it made the whole component for me. I just have to click accept here. And now let's take a look what it looks like. So I import it into the front page here. You can see that I'm importing the calendar component here, and then I'm using it down here. And if we then go to the front page, you can see that now we have a first draft of our calendar component. That's how easy it is. And of course, if I had done this all by myself from scratch, it would have taken me a long time just to get to here. So now you have a good first draft, and then you can then take it from there. So you can really see the power of AI here, right? And by the way, one more thing I also just wanted to say here in the settings area. So again, if you go to cursor settings and then click on cursor settings, there's this rules areas. So if you want to give some specific and general rules every time Cursor gives you something back, you can add it here. So for instance, there's an example here. So always output answers in Portuguese or in Danish or in Norwegian or in German or whatever. Then you can basically add that here, and then it will always do that. So that can also be quite useful in some situations. Great. And then you might have heard about these no-code tools called Lovable and V0 from Next.js, and they are cool. So if you go to Lovable, you can basically write something here and it will create everything for you. The only problem with that is that you have no idea how it is going to be building it, what language, and so on, right? So in the end, it might actually end up creating more problems for you than what it solves. At least that's my experience with using them. I wouldn't use them personally for when building a marketplace. I would do as I just explained in the course here. So use the boilerplate, I would say, and then go from there, and then take your marketplace in whatever direction you would like to take it, using Cursor or Windsurf or Visual Visual Studio Code and use AI as much as possible. And that is it, guys. So if you've been watching until the end here, then first of all, you now know all the basics of how to build an online marketplace using AI from scratch. It's going to be so much cheaper for you than using no-code tools or anything else out there, and you will be able to take it in any direction you would like to. So whatever customization you would like to do on your specific marketplace idea, that will be possible. So you're saving a lot of money and you're now able to create an awesome marketplace just the way you want to. So congratulations. And remember that if you did not know all of this that we've gone through in the course, then you wouldn't know how to properly prompt the AI. So that is why it is super important to know the fundamentals. And now you are an AI marketplace developer because you understand what the AI is actually giving back to you. If you would like to dig deeper, then go ahead and access the full course with all the material, slides, code examples. There's even a Discord channel where all us marketplace builders are discussing and helping each other with building awesome marketplaces. So go ahead and check that out. And also, if you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much, and I hope that it helped. See you. Bye bye. Ciao.